2 weeks after my father's funeral, my ex-husband's new wife slammed forged documents on the table and demanded half my inheritance. Her smirk vanished when my father's secret lawyer stepped forward in court, revealing the hidden clauses in his will that not only protected my estate, but exposed their elaborate fraud scheme. The judge's gavel echoed through the courtroom as she was led away in handcuffs, my ex-husband's pleas for mercy falling on deaf ears. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The rain poured relentlessly. Outside the massive bay windows of my father's estate, the droplets racing down the glass like tears. The reading of the will had concluded just moments ago, and I sat alone in my father's study, surrounded by the dark mahogany shelves that had witnessed decades of his brilliant legal strategies. My fingers traced the edge of his desk, polished, oak that still held the faint impression of his fountain pen, as if he might return any moment to finish one last contract. The knocker on the front door echoed through the empty halls, 3 sharp raps that startled me from my grief. Who would come calling during a storm like this, merely hours after we'd laid my father to rest? I didn't move to answer it. Corinne, our housekeeper for the past 20 years, would see to whoever had the audacity to disturb this day of mourning. A minute passed, then footsteps. Not Corinne's familiar soft tread, but the sharp click of heels against marble, growing louder, more insistent. "Madam, I'm sorry." Corinne appeared at the study door, her normally composed face lined with worry. "I told them it wasn't appropriate today, but they insisted." Before she could finish, 2 figures pushed past her into the room. My breath caught in my throat as recognition dawned. The first was Ethan, my ex-husband of 3 years, his handsome face a careful mask of practiced sympathy. Behind him was Vanessa, his new wife, younger, sleeker, draped in designer clothes that somehow seemed vulgar in the understated elegance of my father's study. Rebecca. Ethan's voice was soft, the same tone he had used when he wanted something during our marriage. "We came as soon as we heard about Judge Hartford's passing. My condolences." I didn't stand, didn't offer them seats. "Thank you for your concern. As you can see, this isn't a good time." Vanessa stepped forward, her red bottom heels clicking against the hardwood floor. She wore a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "We understand this is difficult, Rebecca. That's why we're here, to help you through these complicated matters." "There's nothing complicated about my father's death," I said, my voice steadier. Then I felt, "and nothing that would concern either of you." Ethan exchanged a look with Vanessa before settling himself uninvited in the leather chair across from me. "That's not entirely true, Becca. You see, there are financial considerations that affect us all." I stared at him. This man who had once been my husband, who had shared my bed and my life for 7 years before leaving for his personal assistant. The man who had never once shown interest in my father, beyond what connections Judge Hartford could offer his middling law career. "What are you talking about?" I asked, though something cold settled in my stomach, a premonition of what was coming. Vanessa's smile widened as she opened her designer handbag, extracting a folder with manicured fingers tipped in blood-red polish. "Your father's estate, of course, our share of it." The words hung in the air like the prelude to a thunderclap. I stared at her, certain I had misheard. "Your share?" "Don't look so surprised," Ethan said, leaning forward. "You must have known this conversation was coming eventually." I stood then, anger burning through my grief. "Get out, both of you." Instead of leaving, Vanessa placed the folder on my father's desk and slid it toward me. "You might want to look at these before you throw us out." With reluctant fingers, I opened the folder. Inside were legal documents, contracts with my father's signature at the bottom, loan agreements, investment certificates, partnership deeds, all linking Ethan to my father's business dealings in ways I had never known about. "What is this?" I whispered. "Your father and I had arrangements," Ethan said, his voice taking on the smooth confidence he used in courtrooms. "Financial entanglements that don't simply disappear because he's gone. These documents prove that I'm entitled to a significant portion of his estate, particularly his interests in Hartford Legal Consulting." Hartford Legal Consulting was my father's legacy, a boutique firm that specialized in high-profile estate planning for the wealthiest families in the country. It was worth millions, perhaps tens of millions. "This is absurd," I said, flipping through the papers. "My father would never enter into business with you. He didn't even like you." Vanessa laughed, a tinkling sound that grated against my nerves. "Oh, you'd be surprised what people will do for the right incentives. Judge Hartford recognized Ethan's potential, even if you didn't." I looked more closely at the signatures. They looked authentic. My father's distinctive scrawl with the slight upward tilt at the end of his name. But something felt wrong. My father, Victor Hartford, had been one of the sharpest legal minds in the state. He wouldn't have entered into business dealings with my ex-husband without telling me. "These can't be real," I said, closing the folder. "They're very real," Ethan replied, his confidence unwavering. "And they entitle me to approximately 40% of Hartford Legal Consulting, plus several of the investment properties." The calculation behind his departure suddenly became clear. Had he left me not just for Vanessa, but for what he thought he could get from my father? The thought made me sick. "My father's will was read this morning," I said. "There was no mention of you." "An oversight, I'm sure," Vanessa interjected. "One we'll be remedying with our attorneys, unless you'd prefer to handle this." Quietly. The threat was thinly veiled. They were offering to keep this out of court, for a price. I stood up, my grief momentarily eclipsed by a cold, clear anger. "You have 30 seconds to leave this house before I call security." Ethan sighed, standing as well. "Don't make this difficult, Rebecca. We're prepared to fight for what's legally ours." 20 seconds, I replied. He studied my face, perhaps looking for the same malleability he had exploited during our marriage. Finding none, he nodded to Vanessa. "We'll go. But this isn't over, not by a long shot." Vanessa tucked the folder back into her bag, her smile now sharp as a blade. "Think about it, Rebecca. Do you really want to drag your father's name through a public legal battle? All those private details coming to light? I imagine the great Judge Hartford had secrets he'd rather keep buried." The insinuation made my blood run cold. What did they think they knew about my father? As they turned to leave, Vanessa paused, at the doorway, looking back over her shoulder. "We'll give you a week to come to your senses. After that, we file in court." The door closed behind them, leaving me alone in the study once more. Outside, the rain continued to fall, but I barely noticed it now. My mind was racing, replaying every interaction between Ethan and my father, searching for clues I might have missed. I picked up my phone, scrolling to a contact I hadn't called in years. Dr. Nicola Pierce had been my father's oldest friend and most trusted advisor. If anyone would know the truth about these supposed business dealings, it would be her. As the EI phone rang, I walked to the far wall of the study where a portrait of my father hung, dignified, austere, his eyes holding the quiet intelligence that had made him such a formidable judge. Below the portrait was a safe, hidden behind a sliding panel designed to look like part of the bookcase. Only 3 people knew the combination: my father, myself, and Dr. Pierce. "Rebecca?" Nicola's voice came through the line, warm with concern. "I'm so sorry I couldn't make it to the service. I'm still in Zurich dealing with the conference." "It's all right," I said, my fingers turning the dial on the safe. "Something's happened. Ethan was just here with his wife." A pause. "What did they want?" "They're claiming Dad owed Ethan a substantial portion of his estate. They have documents with his signature." The safe clicked open as Nicola exhaled, sharply. That's not possible. The signatures look real, Nicola. Inside the safe were the expected items, my father's most important documents, his passport, the deed to the house, his will. But there was something else, an envelope I hadn't seen before. It was sealed with wax, imprinted with my father's personal seal, and across the front was written a single word in his unmistakable handwriting: contingency. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Rebecca. Nicola's voice had taken on a strange tone. Did your father ever mention someone named Garrett Frost to you? I frowned, breaking the seal on the envelope. No. Who is he? A lawyer. One of the best forensic document specialists in the country. Your father kept him on retainer for the past 5 years. Why would he need a forensic document specialist? I asked, though as I pulled the contents from the envelope, the answer began to unfold before me. Inside was a dossier labeled Operation Safeguard, with a letter paper-clipped to the front. My hand trembled as I unfolded it and began to read. My father's words. My dearest Rebecca, if you're reading this, I am gone, and certain individuals have made their move sooner than I anticipated. For 3 years, I have been building a case against Ethan Caldwell and his associates. What began as suspicion after your divorce has developed into concrete evidence of forgery, fraud, and attempted extortion. Rebecca? Nicola prompted. Are you still there? I gripped the phone tighter, my eyes scanning the contents of the dossier, surveillance photos, bank records, forensic analyses of forged signatures. My father had known. He had been preparing for this moment. Yes, I said, a strange calm settling over me. I need you to call Garrett Frost. Tell him it's time to execute Operation Safeguard. I'll do it right away, Nicola said without hesitation. Rebecca, your father knew this day might come. He prepared for it. As I hung up, I returned to my father's desk, the dossier open before me. The final page contained a single handwritten note. Rebecca, they will come for what isn't theirs. When they do, remember what I taught you. In chess, the queen is most powerful when the opponent believes she is vulnerable. I've given you everything you need. The rest is up to you. Dad. I closed the folder, a plan already forming in my mind. Let Ethan and Vanessa think they had the upper hand. Let them believe I was overwhelmed by grief and easy to manipulate. They had no idea what was coming for them. Outside, the rain finally stopped, and a shaft of sunlight broke through the clouds, illuminating the chess set in the corner of the study, my father's prized possession. I walked over and picked up the black queen, rolling it between my fingers. Ethan had always underestimated me during our marriage. It had been his greatest mistake then. It would be his downfall now. The morning after Ethan and Vanessa's unwelcome visit, I woke before dawn. Sleep had been elusive, my mind racing with memories and plans. I slipped out of bed and walked to the window, pulling back the heavy curtains to watch the first hints of sunlight creep across the manicured gardens of Hartford Estate. This house had been my anchor since childhood. 12 acres of privacy just outside the city limits, the grand Victorian mansion had witnessed every significant moment of my life. My birthdays celebrated in the Rose Garden. My first legal arguments, practiced in my father's study. My wedding reception held on the sweeping lawn. And now, my father's absence filling every corner. I pressed my palm against the cool glass, watching my breath create a small circle of fog. In the distance, I could see the small gazebo where I used to hide with my case books when I was a law student, determined to follow in my father's footsteps. Victor Hartford had not been an easy man to impress. The youngest judge ever appointed to the federal bench in our state, he had built his reputation on an uncanny ability to see through deception. The truth leaves traces, he would tell me. You just need to know where to look. After retiring from the bench 15 years ago, he had founded Hartford Legal Consulting, turning his judicial experience into a thriving practice that specialized in complex estate planning and fraud prevention. His client list included some of the wealthiest families in the country, people who trusted him implicitly to protect their legacies. My father's own legacy, however, had always been more complicated. I turned from the window and walked to my closet, selecting a simple black dress. As I dressed, I caught sight of my reflection in the mirror, my father's eyes staring back at me, deep brown with flecks of amber. The same eyes that had assessed countless witnesses, defendants, and attorneys over a 40-year legal career. People often remarked how much I resembled him, not just physically but in temperament, methodical, observant, unflinching when it mattered most. I hadn't always embraced these qualities. Downstairs, I found Corinne already in the kitchen, preparing coffee. At 72, she moved more slowly than she once had, but she remained a steady presence in this house. "You're up early, Miss Rebecca," she said, sliding a cup toward me. "Couldn't sleep?" I accepted the coffee with a grateful nod. Too much to think about. Corinne's eyes narrowed slightly. "Those people who came yesterday, they upset you." It wasn't a question. Corinne had witnessed too much of our family's private business over the years to be easily fooled. "They think they have a claim on my father's estate," I replied, keeping my voice neutral. "They're mistaken." Corinne sniffed disapprovingly. "That man never deserved you. Your father knew it before you did." I looked up sharply. "What do you mean?" She busied herself wiping down the already spotless counter. "Nothing that matters now. Judge Hartford handled it in his own way." Before I could press her further, the doorbell rang. Corinne glanced at the clock. "That'll be Dr. Pierce. She called last night to say she'd be coming by early." I found Nicola waiting in the foyer, her silver hair pulled back in its customary tight bun, her tall frame still commanding despite her 70 years. My father's oldest friend, confidant, and occasional adversary, Nicola Pierce, had been a fixture in my life since before I could remember. "Rebecca." She embraced me briefly before pulling back to study my face. "You look tired." "I'm fine," I replied automatically. Her raised eyebrow told me she didn't believe me, but she didn't push. Instead, she handed me a slim leather portfolio. "I brought the files your father asked me to hold, and I contacted Garrett Frost as you requested." We moved to the study, where I closed the door behind us. Sunlight streamed through the windows now, highlighting the dust motes floating in the air. "Tell me everything," I said. "From the beginning." Nicola settled into one of the leather chairs, crossing her long legs. "Your father first suspected something was wrong about 4 years ago, not long after your divorce proceedings began." 4 years ago?" I repeated, surprised. "But he never said anything." She nodded. "Victor was cautious. He didn't want to worry you while you were dealing with the divorce, but he noticed discrepancies in some of his accounts, small amounts, at first easily dismissed as accounting errors." "Ethan was stealing from my father?" "Not directly," Nicola replied. "It was more sophisticated than that. Your father discovered that someone had been accessing confidential client information, trust structures, investment portfolios, vulnerability assessments." I frowned. "How would Ethan have access to that?" "He wouldn't," Nicola said. "Not unless someone inside Hartford Legal was helping him." The implication hit me like a physical blow. "You're saying there was a mole in my father's company?" "Your father confirmed it about 2 years ago. By then, he had already begun setting traps, creating false information, monitoring who accessed which files, tracking digital footprints." I leaned back in my chair, processing this revelation. "And what did he find?" Nicola opened the portfolio she had brought, removing several photographs. These were taken by a private investigator your father hired. The woman is Vanessa Pryor, though she was using the name Vanessa Myers at the time. I examined the photos. They showed Vanessa, before she had married Ethan, meeting with a man I recognized as Calvin Weber, my father's former executive assistant. Calvin resigned suddenly about 18 months ago, I remembered aloud. Dad said he'd taken a position with a firm in Europe. Calvin never went to Europe, Nicola corrected. He disappeared after your father confronted him with evidence of his betrayal. He had been selling confidential information for years, not just to Ethan and Vanessa, but to competitors, journalists, anyone willing to pay. And my father let him go? I asked incredulously. My father had never been one to let betrayal go unpunished. Not exactly. Nicola's expression was grim. Victor let Calvin believe he was free and clear, but he was building a case, gathering evidence, documenting the trail of information theft, and, most importantly, creating a comprehensive record of every forged document that Calvin had helped create. I thought of the dossier I'd found in my father's safe. Operation Safeguard. Yes, Nicola nodded. Your father knew that sooner or later Ethan and his accomplices would make their move. The documents they showed you yesterday were just the beginning. But why? I asked, the question that had been gnawing at me since their visit. Why target my father's estate? Ethan walked away from our divorce with a very generous settlement. He didn't need more money. Nicola's expression softened slightly. Rebecca, it was never just about money for Ethan. It was about power. Specifically, the power that comes from controlling Hartford Legal Consulting. The realization dawned slowly. The client list. Exactly. Your father's firm doesn't just manage estates. It knows where the bodies are buried, metaphorically speaking. The wealthiest families in the country trust Hartford Legal with their most sensitive information. Who they owe, who owes them, where their assets are hidden. Blackmail material, I whispered, feeling sick. Potentially worth far more than the firm itself, Nicola confirmed. Your father always believed that was Ethan's real target. I stood and walked to the window, needing space to think. Outside, gardeners were trimming the hedges, their movements methodical and precise. Normal life continuing while mine seemed to fracture around me. You said my father was building a case, I said finally. Against whom exactly? Not just Calvin Weber or even Ethan, Nicola replied. Your father discovered something bigger, a systematic attempt to infiltrate elite estate planning firms across the country. Hartford Legal wasn't the only target, just the most valuable one. I turned back to face her. A conspiracy? For lack of a better word, yes. Nicola handed me another document from her portfolio. This is a list of known associates. Ethan and Vanessa are merely lieutenants in a much larger organization. The list contained dozens of names, most unfamiliar to me, but one near the by. Top made my blood run cold. Frank Donovan, my godfather and my father's oldest friend. Uncle Frank? I whispered. That can't be right. Nicola's expression remained impassive. Victor confirmed it personally. Frank has been the inside man for years, feeding information about which firms to target, which employees might be vulnerable to recruitment or blackmail. The betrayal was staggering. Frank Donovan had been present at every milestone in my life. He had stood beside my father at my mother's funeral. He had given a toast at my wedding. And all that time, he had been plotting against us. Why? I asked, the single word encompassing a universe of hurt and confusion. Gambling debts, initially, Nicola answered. Then deeper involvement as he realized how profitable it could be. Your father confronted him 3 months ago. I remembered that Frank had abruptly canceled our monthly dinner around that time, claiming health issues. I hadn't seen him since. And then what happened? Frank disappeared, but not before warning the others that Victor was on to them. Nicola's voice had an edge now. Your father's accident occurred 2 weeks later. The implication hung in the air between us. My father's death, a sudden heart attack while alone in his study, had seemed natural, if unexpected. He had been in excellent health for a man of 74. Are you suggesting— I couldn't finish the sentence. I'm not suggesting anything, Nicola said carefully. The medical examiner found nothing suspicious, but the timing concerns me. I closed my eyes briefly, trying to maintain my composure. When I opened them, I spoke with a steadiness that surprised even me. What was my father's plan? He must have had one. Nicola nodded approvingly, as if I had passed some unspoken test. Of course he did. Phase 1 was documentation, building an unassailable case against everyone involved. Phase 2 was legal positioning, creating trusts, shell companies, and protective mechanisms that would make it impossible for them to access Hartford Legal's assets, even if they produced apparently valid documents. And Phase 3? I asked. Justice, Nicola said simply. Your father intended to bring the entire operation down, not just protect his own interests. He was working with federal prosecutors, preparing to hand over everything he had discovered. I absorbed this, thinking of the dossier in my father's safe. But he died before he could execute Phase 3. Yes. Nicola leaned forward. Which is why it falls to you now. I walked to my father's desk, running my fingers along the polished surface. I'm not sure I'm the right person for this, Nicola. I'm a corporate attorney, not a prosecutor, and I certainly don't have my father's connections. You have something more important, Nicola replied. You have his blood in your veins and his training in your head. Victor prepared you for this moment your entire life, whether you realized it or not. I thought back to childhood dinners spent discussing complex legal cases, to summers clerking in my father's chambers, to the rigorous ethical standards he had always demanded of me. Had it all been preparation for this moment? There's something else you should know, Nicola added. Your father changed his will a month before he died. The new provisions activate automatically if anyone contests the original will or presents competing documentation. What provisions? A complete transfer of all Hartford assets, personal and professional, into an irrevocable trust. You are the sole trustee, with absolute discretion over how the assets are managed or distributed. I considered the implications. So even if Ethan somehow manages to convince a court that his documents are legitimate, it won't matter, Nicola finished. The assets will have already been transferred beyond his reach. And Ethan doesn't know about this provision? No one does except for you, me, and Garrett Frost, who drafted the documents. I walked to the chess set in the corner of the study, picking up the White Queen, my father's favorite piece. He had taught me to play when I was 5 years old, emphasizing that the queen was the most powerful piece on the board because of her versatility and range. What would my father do now? I asked, more to myself than to Nicola. She answered anyway. He would wait for them to commit fully to their plan before springing the trap. I set the queen back on the board, my decision made. Then that's what we'll do. Ethan and Vanessa gave me a week to come to my senses. We'll let them think. I'm overwhelmed and vulnerable. Meanwhile, I need to see everything my father compiled. Every document, every recording, every piece of evidence. Nicola stood, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. Now you sound like Victor's daughter. I am my father's daughter, I replied, the determination in my voice surprising even me. And it's time I started acting like it. As Nicola left to make arrangements for the files to be delivered, I remained in the study, looking at the portrait of my father that hung above the fireplace. His expression was serious, but there was a glint in his painted eyes. The look he got when he was about to reveal a particularly clever legal strategy. I hadn't understood until this moment just how thoroughly my father had prepared me for this battle. The childhood chess lessons teaching me to think several moves ahead. The case studies training me to spot patterns and inconsistencies. The ethical dilemmas forcing me to consider the broader implications of every action. My father had known this day might come. He had equipped me with every tool I would need. Now it was up to me to use them. 6 days after Ethan and Vanessa's initial visit, the preliminary hearing for my father's estate was scheduled at the county courthouse. Despite Nicola's advice to wait and let them make the first move, I had decided to file for an expedited probate process. If they wanted a fight, I would choose the battlefield. I arrived early, parking my father's understated gray sedan in the judicial lot, where his reserved space still bore his name. Judge Hartford's daughter still commanded certain privileges in this building where he had presided for decades. The familiar weight of my leather briefcase felt reassuring in my hand as I climbed the stone steps, nodding to the security guards who recognized me with solemn nods. Inside, the marble halls echoed with footsteps and hushed conversations, the scent of lemon polish and old paper creating the distinct atmosphere that had been part of my life since childhood. I found Garrett Frost waiting outside courtroom C, his tall, lean frame propped against the wall as he scrolled through his phone. At 50, Frost had the weathered look of someone who had seen too much and forgotten none of it. He had worked with my father for years, though their professional relationship had been kept deliberately low profile. "Ms. Hartford," he greeted me, slipping his phone into his pocket. His voice was surprisingly gentle for a man with such hard features. "I wish we were meeting under better circumstances." "Mr. Frost." I offered my hand, which he shook firmly. "Thank you for coming on such short notice." He gestured toward the courtroom doors. "I've reviewed the documents your father compiled. Impressive work. He was building a case that would have put away a lot of people for a very long time." "And now that's our job," I said, more confidently than I felt. Frost's expression remained neutral, but something flickered in his eyes. Approval, perhaps. "For today, our job is simpler. We listen. We observe. We let them think they have the upper hand." I nodded, remembering my father's chess strategy. Sometimes the best move is to let your opponent believe they're winning. "Judge Keller is presiding. She worked with my father for years. Will that be a problem? Should we request recusal?" I considered this. "No, Judge Keller is scrupulously fair. If anything, she might be harder on me to avoid any appearance of favoritism." Frost nodded, seemingly satisfied with my assessment. We entered the courtroom together, taking our places at the plaintiff's table. The room was mostly empty, apart from court staff and a few curious attorneys who probably recognized my name on the docket. At precisely 9:30, the side doors opened, and Ethan walked in, flanked by Vanessa and a man I recognized as Patrick Dyer, a flamboyant attorney known for representing wealthy clients in messy divorces. Ethan had dressed for the occasion in a conservative navy suit, his normally casual demeanor replaced by a somber expression that might have seemed genuine to anyone who hadn't lived with him for 7 years. Vanessa, by contrast, had chosen to make a statement. Her crimson dress was expertly tailored but inappropriate for probate court, the designer heels clicking loudly on the hardwood floor as they approached. She caught my eye and smiled, the kind of smile that conveyed nothing but contempt. They settled at the defendant's table, Dyer immediately leaning over to whisper something that made Ethan nod. I kept my expression neutral, though I could feel Vanessa's eyes on me, assessing, searching for any sign of weakness. Judge Marilyn Keller entered from her chambers, her black robe swinging as she took her place at the bench. At 65, she remained sharp-featured and alert, her silver hair cut in a no-nonsense bob. "All rise," the bailiff called, and we stood as Keller settled herself, adjusting her glasses as she reviewed the paperwork before her. "Be seated," she said, her voice crisp. "Estate of Victor Hartford, petition for expedited probate. Ms. Hartford, you're representing yourself in this matter?" "No, Your Honor," I replied, rising again. "I'm represented by Garrett Frost." If Keller was surprised by Frost's presence, she didn't show it. "Mr. Frost, welcome to my courtroom, and Mr. Dyer, representing the interested parties." Dyer stood, straightening his patterned tie. "Yes, Your Honor. I represent Ethan Caldwell and Vanessa Caldwell, who have a substantive claim against the estate of Judge Hartford." Keller's eyebrows rose slightly. "I see. And the nature of this claim?" "My clients had significant business relationships with the deceased. We have documentation proving that Judge Hartford owed substantial assets to Mr. Caldwell, primarily related to Hartford legal consulting." Judge Keller turned to me. "Ms. Hartford, were you aware of these business relationships?" Before I could answer, Frost rose smoothly. "Your Honor, my client was not aware of any legitimate business relationships between her father and Mr. Caldwell. We contest the validity of any documents suggesting otherwise." Dyer smiled, the expression not reaching his eyes. "We anticipated this response, Your Honor. We have evidence demonstrating that Ms. Hartford is well aware of these arrangements, but is attempting to circumvent her father's legitimate obligations." I felt a flicker of unease. What evidence could they possibly have? Judge Keller seemed similarly skeptical. "I'll need to see this evidence, Mr. Dyer." "Of course, Your Honor." Dyer signaled to an assistant who had been sitting quietly in the back row. The young man approached with a slim folder, which Dyer presented to the court clerk for distribution. As copies were handed to the judge, to Frost, and to me, Dyer continued. "What you're looking at, Your Honor, is email correspondence between Judge Hartford and his daughter, discussing the business relationship with Mr. Caldwell." I stared at the printouts in disbelief. They were indeed emails, appearing to be from my father's account to mine, outlining investment strategies involving Ethan and referencing profit-sharing arrangements. "This is fabricated," I said, my voice tight. "I never received these emails." Dyer shook his head in mock sympathy. "Ms. Hartford's denial is understandable, given the circumstances, but the metadata clearly shows these emails were not only sent, but were opened and replied to from her personal account." Judge Keller studied the documents, her expression giving nothing away. "Mr. Frost, your response?" Frost seemed unperturbed as he rose. "Your Honor, anyone with basic technical skills can falsify email headers and metadata. We categorically deny the authenticity of these communications and request time to have our forensic team examine them." "That seems reasonable," Keller agreed. "Mr. Dyer, do you object?" Dyer spread his hands magnanimously. "Not at all, Your Honor. Truth is truth, after all. However, while that analysis is being conducted, we believe it would be prudent for the court to freeze all assets of the Hartford estate to prevent any impulsive transactions." The strategy became clear. They didn't expect these forged emails to stand up to serious scrutiny, but they hoped to paralyze the estate long enough to find a more permanent advantage. Judge Keller turned to me, her expression softening slightly. "Ms. Hartford, as the named executor in your father's will, do you have any objection to a temporary freeze, pending verification of these documents?" Before I could respond, the courtroom doors opened and a tall, distinguished man with silver hair entered quietly, taking a seat in the back row. Frank Donovan, my godfather and the man Nicola had identified as a key figure in the conspiracy against my father. Our eyes met briefly across the courtroom. His expression was impossible to read, but his presence spoke volumes. They were sending a message. "We have more resources than you imagine." I turned back to Judge Keller, aware that everyone was waiting for my response. Frost touched my arm lightly, a silent reminder of our strategy. "No objection, Your Honor. I said calmly. I have nothing to hide. Dyer looked momentarily thrown by my easy acquiescence, but recovered quickly. In that case, Your Honor, we'd also like to request access to Judge Hartford's personal papers and effects, particularly those related to Hartford Legal Consulting. Now Frost did intervene. Your Honor, that would be premature and invasive. Judge Hartford's personal papers may contain privileged communications with clients of his consulting firm. Mr. Dyer's clients have presented no credible evidence that would justify such access. Judge Keller nodded. I agree, Mr. Frost. The asset freeze is granted pending document verification, but access to personal papers is denied at this time. She made a note in her file. Anything else for today? Dyer hesitated, then pressed further. Yes, Your Honor. Given the complexity of this estate and the serious questions regarding its administration, we request that Ms. Hartford be temporarily removed as executor until these matters are resolved. The audacity of the request stunned me into silence. They weren't just after my father's assets. They wanted control of the entire process. Judge Keller's expression hardened. On what grounds, Mr. Dyer? Conflict of interest, Your Honor. If Ms. Hartford has been concealing business relationships relevant to the estate, she cannot be trusted to administer it fairly. I found my voice. That's absurd. These fabricated emails prove nothing. Ms. Hartford, Judge Keller cautioned, please address the court, not opposing counsel. I took a deep breath. I apologize, Your Honor. Frost rose again. Your Honor, there is no legal basis for removing the named executor based on unverified allegations. Mr. Dyer is overreaching. Judge Keller seemed to agree. Motion denied, Mr. Dyer. Ms. Hartford remains executor pending further evidence. She checked her watch. We'll reconvene in 2 weeks after the document analysis is complete. Court adjourned. As the judge left the bench, I gathered my papers, avoiding looking toward where Frank still sat in the back row. But Ethan and Vanessa made it impossible to leave without an encounter, deliberately positioning themselves in my path. Rebecca, Ethan said, his voice carrying just enough for nearby attorneys to hear. This doesn't have to be so adversarial. We're only asking for what your father promised. I looked at him directly, seeing not the man I had once loved, but a stranger whose ambition had consumed whatever decency he might once have possessed. My father promised you nothing, I replied quietly. Vanessa stepped closer, her perfume overwhelming. Don't be naive, she murmured. This is just the beginning. We know things about your father that would destroy his reputation forever. Is that really how you want to remember him? The threat hung in the air between us. Before I could respond, Frost appeared at my side. Ms. Caldwell, he said, his voice icy. Are you threatening my client in front of witnesses? Because that would be extraordinarily unwise. Vanessa's smile never faltered, but she took a step back, just offering friendly advice between family members. We're not family, I said firmly, and we never will be. As we turned to leave, I felt a hand on my arm. Frank Donovan had approached silently, his familiar cologne bringing back memories of holiday dinners and childhood birthdays. Rebecca, he said softly, we need to talk. Privately. Frost moved between us. Mr. Donovan, any communication with my client should go through me. Frank's expression tightened. You don't understand what's happening, Rebecca. There are things your father kept from you, things I need to explain. I think I understand perfectly, I replied, surprised by the steadiness in my voice. Goodbye, Uncle Frank. As we walked away, I could feel their eyes on my back. Ethan, Vanessa, Frank, and others I couldn't name but who were surely watching. From the shadows. For the first time, I truly grasped the scope of what my father had uncovered, and the danger he must have faced alone in his final months. Outside, The October air was sharp with the scent of falling leaves. Frost walked me to my car in silence, waiting until we were safely inside before speaking. "They're worried," he said, sounding satisfied. "They expected you to fight the asset freeze." "Why? What would that have accomplished?" "It would have made you look defensive, possibly desperate. Instead, you appeared confident, unconcerned." I gripped the steering wheel, finally allowing myself to feel the anger I had suppressed in the courtroom. "They forged emails between me and my father. How did they even get access to our accounts?" "They didn't need access," Frost explained. "Modern forgery is about creating plausible digital artifacts. They scraped your public email address, used what they knew about your relationship with your father, and fabricated the rest. Will it stand up to scrutiny? Not a chance. But that's not the point. They're testing your defenses, seeing how you'll react." I thought about Vanessa's threat and Frank's attempted intervention. "What's our next move?" Frost checked his watch. "We have 2 weeks before the next hearing. That's enough time to implement Phase 2 of your father's plan." What exactly did my father have in mind for Phase 2? A small smile crossed Frost's face. Judge Hartford believed in fighting fire with fire. He created his own set of documents, completely legitimate but strategically backdated. Insurance, policies, trust amendments, corporate transfers, all designed to nullify any claim Ethan might make, no matter what documents he produces. I raised an eyebrow. "Isn't that questionable, legally speaking?" "Not at all. Everything was properly executed and notarized. Your father simply chose when to file them officially." Frost shrugged. "Timing is everything in litigation." As we drove away from the courthouse, I glanced in my rearview mirror. Frank Donovan stood on the steps, watching our departure. For a moment, I saw not the traitor Nicola had described, but the man who had taught me to ride a bike, who had brought me ice cream after my mother's funeral. How had it come to this? What had happened to turn someone I had loved and trusted into an enemy? The questions lingered as we headed back to Hartford Estate to prepare for the next phase of the battle. I had endured their first attack, maintained my composure in the face of their forged evidence and veiled threats. But the real fight was just beginning, and I knew the next confrontation would be far more brutal. They had shown their willingness to lie, to threaten, perhaps even to harm. My father had paid the ultimate price for standing against them. I would need to be smarter, more careful, and more ruthless than they expected if I hoped to survive with my father's legacy, and perhaps my own life, intact. Raindrops streaked across the library windows of Hartford Estate, the steady drumming on the roof creating a cocoon of white noise that insulated me from the outside world. 3 days had passed since the preliminary hearing, and I had retreated into my father's private sanctuary, surrounded by first-edition law texts and leather-bound journals documenting 50 years of legal thought. I had barely slept, spending hours poring over the dossiers from Operation Safeguard, trying to absorb the full scope of what my father had uncovered. The documents revealed a pattern of infiltration targeting wealthy families' estate planning, not just ours, but dozens of others. The organization operated like a sophisticated intelligence agency, placing long-term assets in positions of trust, gathering information for years before making their moves. I pushed aside a stack of surveillance photos and leaned back in my father's chair, rubbing my eyes. The magnitude of what I was facing had finally sunk in. This wasn't just about Ethan and Vanessa's greed or a simple inheritance dispute. I was up against a criminal enterprise with resources, connections, and a willingness to eliminate obstacles, potentially including my father. A soft knock at the door interrupted my thoughts. Corinne entered, carrying a silver tray with tea and sandwiches. "You need to eat something," she said, setting the tray down firmly. It wasn't a suggestion. "Thank you," I replied, realizing I couldn't remember when I'd last had a proper meal. Any calls? Dr. Pierce phoned this morning, said she'd stop by this evening. Corinne hesitated, then added, and that man has been parked across the street again, the black sedan. I nodded, unsurprised. They're watching the house. Should I call the police? No, I said, pouring tea from the antique pot my mother had loved. They're not doing anything illegal, just observing. Let them watch. Corinne frowned, clearly unhappy with my response. Your father wouldn't have tolerated such intrusion. My father, I said carefully, kept too many secrets. Look where that got him. The words came out harsher than I intended. Corinne had been loyal to my father for decades. Criticizing him felt like a betrayal of her as well. But the truth was, I was angry. Angry that he had discovered this conspiracy years ago and chosen to fight it alone. Angry that he hadn't trusted me enough to involve me until it was too late. Corinne studied me for a moment, then sighed. He was trying to protect you, Miss Rebecca. That's what fathers do. I'm not a child who needed protection, I replied. I'm a Harvard-educated attorney who could have helped him. Perhaps. She smoothed her apron with practiced hands. But you were also his daughter, and that mattered more to him than your law degree. After she left, I forced myself to eat half a sandwich while continuing to review the files. One document in particular had been troubling me, a handwritten note from my father dated just 3 weeks before his death. Frank made contact today. Claims he wants to come in from the cold. Says he has documentation that would break the case. Wide open. Don't trust him, but can't ignore the possibility. Meeting scheduled for Octima, 15. October 15th, the day my father died. Had Frank Donovan been there? Had their meeting somehow led to my father's death? The medical examiner had found nothing suspicious, ruling it a heart attack, but the timing was too convenient to ignore. My phone buzzed with a text from Garrett Frost. Analysis confirmed forgeries. Obvious manipulation of metadata. Will file report with court tomorrow. I wasn't surprised. The forged emails had been a clumsy opening move, probably designed as a distraction, while they prepared something more substantial. The question was, what would they try next? The rain intensified as evening approached, transforming the library windows into cascading sheets of water. I was about to call Nicola to confirm our meeting when my phone rang, an unknown number. Rebecca Hartford, I answered cautiously. Rebecca. The voice was unmistakable. Frank Donovan. Don't hang up, please. I should have ended the call immediately, but something in his tone gave me pause. What do you want, Frank? To explain. He sounded tired, his usual confidence absent. Not over the phone, in person. Why would I agree to that? Because you need to know the truth about what happened to Victor. A pause. And because despite what you've been told, I was never your father's enemy. I laughed, a short, bitter sound. I've seen the evidence, Frank. My father documented everything. What you've seen is incomplete. His voice grew urgent. Victor and I were working together at the end. Ask yourself, why would I show up at that hearing? Why expose myself? The question had bothered me. Frank's appearance in court had seemed oddly performative, almost as if he wanted to be seen. You have 5 minutes, I said finally. Where? The boathouse. 1 hour. He hung up before I could respond. The Hartford boathouse sat at the edge of our property, a small wooden structure overlooking the lake that bordered the eastern boundary of the estate. As children, my father and Frank had spent summers there, fishing and swimming. Later, it had become my father's retreat when he needed to think through difficult cases. Going alone would be reckless. Frank had been identified as a key player in the conspiracy, possibly involved in my father's death. But calling Frost or Nicola would take time I didn't have, and local police would dismiss my concerns as paranoia. I changed into practical clothing, jeans, boots, a dark sweater, and slipped my father's small revolver into my pocket. He had insisted I learn to shoot when I was 16, concerned about potential threats due to his position on the bench. I had never needed to use the gun, had never even fired it outside of practice at his private range, but its weight was reassuring now. The rain had slowed to a drizzle as I took the path through the woods to the boathouse. Motion-activated security, lights illuminated my way at intervals, though the dense trees created pools of shadow between them. In daylight, this walk was peaceful. Tonight, every rustling leaf seemed menacing. The boathouse appeared through the trees, its weathered frame silhouetted against the lake. No lights shone from within, but Frank's Mercedes was parked nearby, confirming he had arrived. I approached cautiously, one hand in my pocket, gripping the revolver. The wooden dock creaked beneath my feet as I reached the entrance. The door stood slightly ajar. "Frank!" I called, pushing it open wider. The interior was dark and smelled of damp wood and algae. My father's old rowboat rested on its rack, fishing equipment hanging neatly on the walls. No sign of Frank. I was about to step back outside when a voice came from the shadows at the far end. "Lock the door behind you." Instinctively, I drew the revolver, pointing it toward the voice. "Show yourself first." Frank emerged slowly from the darkness, hands raised slightly. "I'm alone, Rebecca. Please secure the door. We can't risk being overheard." Despite my misgivings, I pushed the door closed and turned the old iron lock. "You have 5 minutes," I reminded him, keeping the gun steady. "You won't need that." He gestured to the revolver. "If I wanted to harm you, I wouldn't have chosen a meeting place your security system monitors." He was right. My father had installed cameras covering every approach to the boathouse years ago. I lowered the gun slightly, but didn't put it away. Frank looked older than he had in court, the lines in his face deeper, his shoulders slightly stooped. He wore no coat despite the chill, his shirt wrinkled as if he'd been wearing it for days. "Your father wasn't murdered," he said abruptly. But his death wasn't entirely natural either. I tightened my grip on the gun. "Explain." "Victor had a heart condition. Did you know that?" I shook my head. My father had always been healthy, vigorous even in his 70s. He was diagnosed 3 years ago, kept it private. Only his doctor, his lawyer, and I knew. Frank moved to sit on an old wooden bench, his movements stiff. He was taking medication, but the stress of the investigation was taking its toll. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you need to understand. Victor knew the risks. He chose to continue despite them." "Continue what exactly?" I demanded. "Nicholas showed me evidence that you were working against my father, feeding information to his enemies." Frank closed his eyes briefly. "I was, at first." The admission struck me like a physical blow. "Why?" "He trusted you. We both did." "I made mistakes," he said simply. "Bad investments, gambling debts. They approached me at my most vulnerable, offering a way out. All I had to do was share information about Victor's clients, their estate structures, vulnerabilities. And you agreed." My voice was flat with disgust. "Yes." No excuses, no justification, just the bare acknowledgement of his betrayal. For almost 2 years, I was their inside source, but then I discovered what they really wanted. Access to Hartford. "Legal's client information?" I supplied. He looked surprised. "You know about that?" My father's files were very thorough." Frank nodded slowly. "What you may not know is that they weren't just after blackmail material. They were systematically destroying estate plans, creating legal chaos that would force assets into the open where they could be seized through litigation." "Financial terrorism," I murmured, remembering a term my father had coined during a case involving market manipulation. "Exactly. When I realized the scale of their operation, I went to Victor, confessed everything." He ran a hand over his face. I expected him to turn me in immediately. Instead, he offered me a deal. What kind of deal? Immunity in exchange for helping him bring down the entire network. I would continue as their asset, but feeding them information Victor wanted them to have. Altered documents, misleading assessments, strategic misinformation. The pieces began to align with what I had found in my father's notes. You became a double agent. For the last year of his life, yes. It was Victor's idea to use me to plant evidence that would lead to their eventual prosecution. Frank leaned forward, his expression earnest. That's why I can't let you proceed with what you think is his plan. You're working from incomplete information. I studied him, trying to determine if he was telling the truth. If you were working with my father, why appear in court with Ethan and Vanessa? Because that was always the contingency plan. If anything happened to Victor, I was to maintain my cover until we could be certain his evidence was secure. Frank stood, wincing slightly. The people behind this? They're powerful, Rebecca. Not just wealthy, but connected at the highest levels of government and finance. Do they have names? I asked. My father's files identified several key players, but never the leadership. Frank hesitated, then reached slowly into his pocket. I raised the gun again instinctively. Easy, he murmured, withdrawing a small USB drive. This contains everything: names, accounts, communication records. Victor asked me to keep it separate from his other evidence. Insurance in case they ever breached his security. He held it out to me. I stared at it, uncertain. This could be a trap, I said. The drive could contain malware designed to infiltrate my father's systems. It could, Frank agreed. But it doesn't. Victor encoded it himself. You'll need his personal passphrase to access it. That gave me pause. My father's encryption protocols were legendarily complex. If this drive was authentic, it would require a passphrase only I would know. Why give this to me now? I asked, still suspicious. Why not at the courthouse? Because they're making their move. The hearing was just a feint. They're planning something bigger. His expression darkened. Ethan was instructed to file those forged emails knowing they wouldn't stand up to scrutiny. It was meant to distract you while they accessed the real target, which is the Hartford Legal Client Vault, physical and digital records stored in your father's office building downtown. There's a vulnerability in the security system, a maintenance window scheduled for tonight between 2 and 4 a.m. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the damp air. How do you know this? Because I helped identify the vulnerability, Frank admitted. It was part of my cover. What they don't know is that Victor installed a secondary system that will activate if the primary is breached, but only if someone with the master code authorizes it. Let me guess, I said, the pieces falling into place. I'm the only one who can activate it now. Frank nodded. You have until midnight to reach the building and enter the override sequence. I checked my watch. 9:17 p.m. Less than 3 hours. Why should I believe any of this? Frank stood, his expression somber. Because despite everything, I loved your father like a brother. And because I owe him this, to fulfill my part of our last plan together. He gestured to the USB drive. Take it or don't. Go to the office tonight or don't. But know this. If they access those records, dozens of families will have their legacies destroyed, and Hartford Legal will be implicated in the largest estate fraud in history. I had spent days immersed in my father's investigation, enough to know that Frank's warning aligned with the patterns my father had documented. The timing of the security maintenance was verifiable. The risk was real. But so was the possibility of walking into a trap. I need to make a call, I said, stepping away while keeping Frank in my sight. I dialed Frost's number, speaking quietly when he answered. Can you verify a scheduled security maintenance at the Hartford Legal Building tonight? There was a pause, the sound of typing. Yes. Systems going offline from 2 to 4 a.m. for updates. How did you know? Frank Donovan told me. He says it's a vulnerability they plan to exploit. Frost's voice sharpened. You're with Donovan? Where? The boathouse. He says he was working with my father at the end, as a double agent. That's possible, Frost admitted reluctantly. Your father compartmentalized information. Even I wasn't aware of all his strategies. He's given me a USB drive that supposedly contains evidence against the leadership. And he says, I need to go to the office tonight to activate some secondary security system. The Sentinel Protocol, Frost said immediately. Your father mentioned it, but I've never seen it in operation. It was his failsafe against digital intrusion. The fact that Frost knew about it lent credibility to Frank's story. Should I go? Frost was silent for a moment. It's risky. But if they're planning a breach tonight, the Sentinel may be our only defense. I can meet you there. No, I decided. If this is legitimate, I need you to coordinate with the federal authorities your father was working with. Get them on standby in case we identify the perpetrators in the act. And if it's a trap? I looked at Frank, who waited patiently, making no attempt to overhear my conversation. Then I'll handle it. After ending the call, I turned back to Frank. I'll go to the office, but you're coming with me. He nodded, unsurprised. I expected nothing less. And if this turns out to be deception, I added, remember that I have my father's gun, and I know how to use it. Frank's expression remained somber. If I'm lying to you, Rebecca, I'll deserve whatever comes. As we walked back through the woods toward the main house, the security lights casting long shadows through the trees, I felt a strange sense of clarity. For days, I had been reacting to events, struggling to catch up with a conspiracy my father had tracked for years. Now, finally, I was making a choice, choosing to trust my instincts, to take action rather than merely respond. If Frank was telling the truth, tonight could mark the beginning of the end for those who had targeted my father and countless others. If he was lying, I was walking into danger with my eyes open, prepared to face whatever came. Either way, I was no longer simply Victor Hartford's daughter, inheriting a battle not of my making. I was choosing my path, embracing the fight on my own terms. The decision brought with it a certain peace. I had spent the days since my father's death feeling unmoored, adrift in a sea of revelations and betrayals. Now, with a clear purpose, before me, I felt something of my father's legendary resolve settling into my bones. Back at the house, I changed quickly into dark clothing suitable for the night ahead, while Frank waited in the kitchen, Corinne watching him suspiciously as she prepared coffee for our vigil. I retrieved my father's spare keycard and security codes from his safe, along with a small leather case containing specialized tools he had shown me years ago. Insurance, he had called them. Against those who believe electronic locks are infallible. As I was about to close the safe, my gaze fell on the chess queen I had placed there days earlier. On impulse, I picked it up, slipping it into my pocket, a reminder of the game we were playing and the stakes involved. With the queen came a memory, my father's voice, patient but insistent during one of our childhood lessons. The queen's power lies not just in her mobility, but in her restraint. Know when to attack, when to defend, and when to sacrifice. That's the art of the game. Tonight would test all three aspects of that strategy. I would need to be ready to attack if the opportunity presented itself, to defend against whatever traps might be laid, and to sacrifice my safety if it meant protecting my father's legacy and the clients who had trusted him. As I descended the stairs to where Frank waited, the weight of the revolver in one pocket and the chess queen in the other, I knew there would be no turning back from the path I had chosen. Whatever happened at Hartford Legal tonight would determine the course of this battle and, perhaps, the rest of my life. I was making my move, and like the queen on my father's chessboard, I intended to be the most formidable piece in play. The Hartford Legal Consulting Building stood 12 stories tall in the financial district, its glass facade reflecting the city lights like a dark mirror. At 11:30 p.m., the surrounding streets were nearly deserted, most of the neighboring offices having gone dark hours earlier. Frank parked his Mercedes in the underground garage, using a pass card that surprised me with its continued validity. "Your father never revoked my access," he explained, noticing my expression. Another sign that we were working together at the end. I remained silent, still not fully trusting his story despite its internal consistency. We took the service elevator to the 10th floor where Hartford Legal occupied the entire space. The reception area was dark, illuminated only by the glow of emergency exit signs and the distant lights of the city filtering through the floor-to-ceiling windows. I swiped my father's key card at the security panel, keying in the 6-digit code that granted after-hours access. The light blinked green, and the glass doors slid open with a soft hiss. "The main system control room is through your father's office," Frank said, his voice low despite the emptiness of the building. I nodded, leading the way down the carpeted hallway. Family portraits lined the walls. Generations of Hartfords, serious-faced men and women in judicial robes and business attire. My father had been adamant about displaying our lineage, a reminder of the weight of the Hartford name and the responsibility it carried. My father's corner office was exactly as he had left it. Meticulous, elegant, with no indication of the secrets it contained. I moved to the antique desk, running my fingers along its polished surface to find the hidden button beneath the edge. With a soft click, a panel in the bookcase slid open, revealing a small room beyond. "The sanctum?" Frank murmured. "I've never been inside." "Few have," I replied, stepping through the opening. The room beyond was the heart of Hartford Legal's security system, a compact space lined with servers, monitors displaying security camera feeds, and a sophisticated computer terminal. I sat at the console, the chair still adjusted to my father's height. The screen prompted for a password. I typed in the phrase my father had created years ago, a line from a poem my mother had loved, followed by my birth date. The system accepted, the credentials displaying a simple menu of options. I located the Sentinel protocol, a subsystem I had never encountered during my time working with my father. "What exactly does this do?" I asked Frank, who stood watching from the doorway. "Creates a complete backup of all client data before purging the main servers and triggering a lockdown. If someone tries to breach the system tonight, they'll find nothing but empty databases." "And the backup?" "Encrypted, then transmitted to a secure location. Only you and Frost will be able to access it." I hesitated, my finger hovering over the activation command. "This seems extreme. Are you absolutely certain they're planning to breach tonight?" Frank's expression was grim. "I've been in enough of their planning meetings to recognize the pattern. They create a distraction, like the court hearing, then strike when they think you're focused elsewhere." The logic was sound, consistent with what I had learned from my father's files about their methodology. Still, triggering such a drastic security measure wasn't a decision to take lightly. "If I'm wrong," Frank added quietly, "the worst outcome is temporary inconvenience. If I'm right, you'll have preserved your father's life's work." Put that way, the choice seemed clear. I entered the final authorization code and initiated the Sentinel protocol. The screen displayed a progress bar as the system began its work, backing up, encrypting, preparing for the defensive purge that would protect our client's sensitive information. "It'll take about 30 minutes to complete," I said, watching the progress indicator slowly advance. "Then what?" "Then we wait," Frank replied. "If they follow their usual pattern, they'll send a technical team to exploit the maintenance window. 2, possibly 3 operatives." I raised an eyebrow. "And we just let them walk in?" "The federal agents Frost is contacting will handle the arrests. Our job is to ensure the system is protected and to document the breach attempt. As if on cue, my phone vibrated with a text from Frost. Federal team on standby. ETA 20 minutes. Stay out of sight. I showed the message to Frank, who nodded with apparent satisfaction. Everything's proceeding as your father would have wanted. The progress bar had reached 40% when the first security alert flashed on one of the monitors. Someone had entered the parking garage, 2 figures in maintenance uniforms, carrying tool cases. Right on schedule, Frank murmured, studying the grainy security footage. They'll use service credentials to bypass the main entrance. Shouldn't we hide? I asked, suddenly aware of our vulnerable position. Frank shook his head. This room doesn't appear on any building schematics. As long as we stay quiet, they won't know we're here. I wasn't entirely convinced, but I trusted my father's paranoia enough to believe he would have created an undetectable sanctuary. We watched in silence as the intruders made their way through the building, using what appeared to be legitimate access cards to move past security checkpoints. Those are actual maintenance credentials, Frank explained. They probably bribed or coerced someone from the building management company. The Sentinel protocol had reached 75% completion when the intruders exited the elevator on our floor. I held my breath as they moved confidently down the hallway, heading directly for the main server room at the opposite end from my father's office. They don't know about this room, Frank whispered unnecessarily. They think all the critical systems are in the main server farm. We watched as they entered the server room, setting up equipment with practiced efficiency. One began connecting a laptop to the main terminal while the other installed what looked like a small device on several server racks. Hardware bypass, Frank identified. They're attempting to circumvent the security protocols by connecting directly to the storage drives. The Sentinel progress bar reached 92%, 93%, 94%. On the monitor, one of the intruders suddenly froze, staring at his laptop screen with evident confusion. He typed rapidly, his body language becoming increasingly agitated. He's noticed something's happening to the data, I whispered. Frank nodded, a grim smile playing at his lips. Too late. The progress bar hit 100%. A new message appeared on the screen. Protocol complete. Purge initiated. On the security monitor, we watched as the intruder's laptop displayed something that caused both men to panic. They disconnected hastily, gathering their equipment with none of their previous methodical care. They know they've failed, Frank said with satisfaction. Just then, another alert flashed on the security monitors. More people entering the building, a team in tactical gear, moving with military precision. Frost's federal agents had arrived. Time to go, Frank said urgently. We don't want to be caught in the middle of an arrest operation. I hesitated. Shouldn't we stay to explain why we're here? To provide evidence? Your presence has been documented in the security logs. The system will show you legitimately activated emergency protocols. Let the federal team handle the arrests. That was always the plan. He was right. My father had designed this operation meticulously, creating a path that would lead to legal prosecution without putting me at unnecessary risk. We slipped out through my father's private elevator, a feature few knew existed, emerging in a small alcove off the main parking structure, just as the tactical team secured the building entrance. As we drove away, I watched the building recede. In the side mirror, lights now flashing from several police vehicles that had joined the federal team. Phase 1 complete, Frank said, breaking the silence that had fallen between us. Now comes the harder part. Which is connecting these foot soldiers to their commanders. Your father spent years trying to identify who's really behind this operation. I fingered the USB drive Frank had given me, which now sat in my jacket pocket. You said this contains that information. Some of it. Names, accounts, communication records, enough to point investigators in the right direction. But these people are careful. They operate through layers of cutouts and shell companies. Like Ethan and Vanessa, I surmised. Frank nodded. Exactly. Disposable assets who don't even know who they're really working for. They believe they're part of a sophisticated financial operation, not a criminal enterprise. We drove in silence for several minutes, the rhythmic sweep of windshield wipers marking time as a light rain began to fall. I stared out at the darkened city streets, processing the events of the night. For the first time since my father's death, I had taken direct action, applied what he had taught me to protect what he had built. The sensation was both empowering and sobering. I had activated an emergency protocol that would have significant repercussions for Hartford Legal, our clients, and the investigation my father had begun. What happens tomorrow? I asked. The news will report a failed cyber attack on Hartford Legal. The arrested individuals will face serious federal charges. Ethan and Vanessa will realize their plan has failed, but they won't know how or why. And the organization behind them? Frank's expression darkened. They'll adapt, send different operatives, try new tactics, but now they know someone is actively opposing them, which makes them both more cautious and more dangerous. I thought about the court hearing scheduled for the following week. Ethan and Vanessa will still pursue their claim on my father's estate. Of course, their primary mission may have failed, but they'll continue with the secondary objective. The organization doesn't abandon targets easily. We had reached Hartford Estate, the iron gate swinging open automatically as Frank's car approached. The house beyond was dark except for a single light in the kitchen, Corinne waiting up, despite the late hour. I should go, Frank said, pulling up to the front entrance but keeping the engine running. It's safer if I maintain my cover for now. I studied him in the dim light of the car interior. Hours ago, I had pointed a gun at this man, convinced he was my enemy. Now I had witnessed him help thwart a criminal operation targeting my father's firm. The question remained, could I trust him completely? The USB drive, I said. I'll need to verify its contents before I can fully accept your story. He nodded, unsurprised. I'd expect nothing less from Victor's daughter. The passphrase is, Minerva's owl takes flight at dusk. Despite everything, I smiled slightly. The phrase was quintessentially my father, a classical reference wrapped in metaphor. How will I contact you? I asked. You won't. I'll find a way to reach you when it's safe. He glanced at the rearview mirror, his expression tightening. They'll be watching you more closely than ever now. I opened the car door, then paused. Thank you, Frank. For tonight. His face softened momentarily. I owed it to your father, and to you. Then his expression grew serious again. Be careful, Rebecca. What happened tonight will force them to accelerate their plans. They can't afford to wait for the court process now. With that warning lingering in the air, I stepped out into the light rain. Frank's car disappeared down the driveway seconds later, leaving me alone with the weight of new knowledge and the uncertainty of what would come next. Inside, Corinne waited in the kitchen as expected, a pot of tea steeping on the counter. She looked up as I entered, relief washing over her weathered features. You're back, she said simply. Safe? Yes, I confirmed, accepting the cup she offered, and perhaps a step ahead for the first time. There was a call, she said, sliding a notepad toward me. Ms. Pierce said it was urgent. I glanced at the message. New documents filed with court. Emergency hearing scheduled for 9 a.m. Call immediately. So Ethan and Vanessa had already made their next move. The timing couldn't be coincidental. They must have been notified about the failed breach at Hartford Legal and were now accelerating their legal attack as Frank had predicted. I excused myself to call Nicola, taking my tea to my father's study. As I dialed, I found myself standing before the chess set again, the Black Queen missing from its usual place, safely tucked in my pocket throughout the night's events. Nicola answered on the first ring, her voice alert despite the late hour. Rebecca, you've been busy tonight? You heard about Hartford Legal? Frost kept me informed. A successful operation by all accounts. What's this about new court? Filings? I asked, getting to the point. Ethan's attorney filed an emergency petition alleging you've violated the asset freeze by purging company data. They're claiming it constitutes destruction of estate assets. I couldn't help but laugh at the audacity. They're the ones who tried to steal the data. We know that, but proving it in court is different. The two men arrested haven't been linked to Ethan yet. What does Frost recommend? Complete transparency about the security protocol. Your father documented everything meticulously. We can prove it was a legitimate defensive measure against an identified threat. I rolled the chess queen between my fingers, thinking, they're getting desperate. First the forged emails, now this rushed petition. Desperation makes them dangerous, Nicola cautioned. Be prepared for more aggressive tactics. After ending the call, I moved to my father's desk, inserting Frank's USB drive into my laptop. The drive prompted for the passphrase, which I entered carefully. Minerva's owl takes flight at dusk. The encryption unlocked, revealing dozens of folders meticulously organized and labeled. Financial records, surveillance photos, email transcripts, offshore account details. A comprehensive map of criminal activity spanning years. And at the center of it all, a name I recognized instantly. Senator William Hargrove, chairman of the Senate Banking Committee and one of the most powerful men in Washington. The revelation stole my breath. If this information was accurate, the Yachida conspiracy reached to the highest levels of government. No wonder my father had proceeded with such caution. No wonder Frank feared for my safety. I worked through the night, absorbing as much of the evidence as possible before the morning hearing. By dawn, I had compiled a concise summary and forwarded it to Frost with instructions to share it with his federal contacts. As I watched the sunrise paint the sky in shades of pink and gold, I felt a strange calm settle over me. I had spent years practicing corporate law, negotiating deals and reviewing contracts. Nothing in my professional experience had prepared me for criminal conspiracies, midnight operations, or life-and-death stakes. Yet somehow, I felt more centered, more focused than ever before. My father had trained me for this moment through countless chess games, ethical debates, and legal discussions. He had shaped me to carry on his legacy, not just as a lawyer, but as someone who could stand against corruption and injustice. Today in court, Ethan and Vanessa would discover that I was not the grieving, vulnerable woman they had counted on manipulating. They would face an adversary they hadn't anticipated, one who had begun to master the skills needed to dismantle their plans piece by piece. The game was evolving, and so was I. The county courthouse hummed with unusual energy for such an early hour. News of the attempted breach at Hartford Legal had already made the morning headlines, with speculation running wild about potential motives and perpetrators. Reporters clustered near the entrance, hungry for details about the connection between the break-in and the emergency hearing scheduled for 9 a.m. I slipped in through a side entrance Frost had arranged, avoiding the press while gathering my thoughts for the confrontation ahead. In the small conference room where we met, Frost was already reviewing documents, his reading glasses perched low on his nose. You look remarkably composed for someone who spent the night thwarting corporate espionage, he observed, sliding a coffee cup toward me. Necessity, I replied, accepting the coffee gratefully. The caffeine wouldn't erase my exhaustion, but it might sharpen my focus for the next few critical hours. Have you reviewed the USB contents? Frost nodded, his expression grave. Explosive. Material. If authenticated, it implicates people who consider themselves untouchable. He lowered his voice despite the privacy of the room. Senator Hargrove has friends in every branch of government, including the judiciary. We'll need to proceed with extreme caution. Is Judge Keller compromised? Not to my knowledge. She's known for her independence, but even incorruptible judges can be influenced by political pressure. I sipped my coffee, contemplating our position. What's our strategy for today? Transparency about the security protocol, as Nicholas suggested. We'll present it as a standard emergency measure triggered by legitimate security concerns. Frost shuffled through his papers. The purged data was fully backed up, so we can argue there was no destruction of assets, merely protection. And the timing? I asked. They'll claim it's suspiciously convenient. Which is why we've subpoenaed the building's security logs and maintenance records. They'll confirm the scheduled system update that created the vulnerability. I nodded, reassured by Frost's thoroughness. My father had chosen his allies well. At 8:55, we made our way to courtroom C. Ethan and Vanessa had already arrived, seated beside Patrick Dyer at the defendant's table. Vanessa wore a conservative navy suit today, her previous flamboyance replaced by calculated restraint, an attempt to appear serious and credible. Ethan, however, couldn't conceal his agitation. He drummed his fingers on the table, repeatedly checking his phone until Dyer placed a hand on his arm to still him. Their whispered conversation looked tense, bordering on argumentative. Trouble in paradise, Frost murmured as we took our seats. Failure tends to strain partnerships. Judge Keller entered precisely at 9:00, the courtroom rising in unison. Her expression revealed nothing as she took her place at the bench, though her eyes lingered briefly on the unusual number of spectators filling the gallery. Be seated, she instructed, adjusting her reading glasses. We're here on an emergency petition filed by counsel for Ethan and Vanessa Caldwell, alleging violation of the temporary asset freeze in the Hartford estate matter. She fixed Dyer with a stern look. Mr. Dyer, you've claimed that Ms. Hartford has deliberately destroyed estate assets. That's a serious allegation. Dyer rose, buttoning his suit jacket with practiced smoothness. Indeed, Your Honor. Last night, during a scheduled maintenance window, Ms. Hartford personally entered the Hartford legal consulting offices and executed what they're calling a security protocol that effectively wiped the company's servers of all client data and proprietary information. He paused for effect, gauging the judge's reaction. When Keller merely waited expectantly, he continued with increased intensity. This was a clear attempt to prevent my clients from accessing information relevant to their valid claim against the estate. By purging these records, Ms. Hartford has violated both the spirit and letter of Your Honor's asset freeze order. Judge Keller turned to me. Ms. Hartford, these are troubling claims. Your response? Frost stood smoothly. Your Honor, if I may address this first, Garrett Frost, representing Ms. Hartford. At Keller's nod, he continued. The facts are straightforward. Last night, Hartford Legal Consulting was the target of a sophisticated cyber attack, coinciding with a scheduled system maintenance window. 2 individuals have already been arrested by federal authorities in connection with this attempted breach. He held up a file. We have here the security logs showing unauthorized access attempts targeting confidential client information. Ms. Hartford, as executor of her father's estate and a principal of Hartford Legal, implemented a pre-existing security protocol designed specifically for such emergencies. And this protocol involved wiping servers? Keller asked. A temporary security measure, Your Honor. All data was backed up before being removed from vulnerable systems. Nothing was destroyed, merely protected from theft or manipulation. Dyer scoffed audibly. How convenient that this attack occurred. Just as my clients are seeking access to records that would validate their claim. Judge Keller's eyes narrowed slightly. Mr. Dyer, do you have evidence connecting Ms. Hartford to the individuals arrested last night? Not at this time, Your Honor, but then I suggest you avoid insinuations without foundation, Keller interrupted sharply. Mr. Frost, do you have documentation of this security protocol's existence prior to last night? Yes, Your Honor. Frost handed a document to the clerk. This is the Hartford Legal Security Directive, created 3 years ago and updated annually. It clearly outlines the circumstances under which the Sentinel Protocol may be activated and the procedures for data protection and recovery. Judge Keller reviewed the document carefully. These signatures, Judge Hartford, Ms. Hartford, and Mr. Frost, all appear properly notarized. They are, Your Honor. The protocol was legally established as part of Hartford Legal's fiduciary responsibility to its clients. Keller set the document aside. Mr. Dyer, your petition requests that Ms. Hartford be held in contempt for violating the asset freeze. Based on the evidence presented, I'm not seeing a violation. The assets appear to have been protected, not destroyed. Dyer changed tactics. Your Honor, at minimum, we request immediate access to the backup data to verify its integrity. My clients have reason to believe that Ms. Hartford may have altered records relevant to their claim. What records specifically? Frost challenged. And what legal basis does Mr. Caldwell have for accessing confidential client information of a firm where he has never been employed? Dyer hesitated, glancing at Ethan, who leaned forward to whisper urgently in his ear. The consultation lasted several uncomfortable seconds before Dyer straightened. Your Honor, we have reason to believe that Judge Hartford maintained personal records of his business dealings with my client. These would be distinct from protected client information. It was a reasonable pivot, but Frost was prepared. Ms. Hartford has already provided all personal records from her father's estate in compliance with discovery requirements. If Mr. Caldwell believes specific documents are missing, he should identify them with particularity. Judge Keller seemed to agree. Mr. Dyer, does your client have a specific document in mind? Something that would establish the business relationship he claims existed? Ethan whispered to Dyer again, more intensely this time. Vanessa joined the discussion, her composed facade cracking slightly as she gestured emphatically. The whispered conference grew heated enough that Judge Keller cleared her throat pointedly. Mr. Dyer, do you need a moment with your clients? No, Your Honor, Dyer replied, though the strain in his voice was evident. My clients believe Judge Hartford kept a private ledger documenting their profit-sharing arrangement. This ledger would have been stored on Hartford Legal's secure server. It was a clever claim, specific enough to sound legitimate, but vague enough to be difficult to disprove. If such a ledger had existed, the security protocol would have backed it up, along with all other data. Frost seemed to consider this before responding. Your Honor, if such a document exists in the backup data, we have no objection to producing it, provided that a neutral third party conducts the search using specific parameters agreed upon by both sides. The concession caught Dyer off guard. He had clearly expected outright refusal, which would have strengthened his argument for broader access. Judge Keller nodded approvingly. That seems reasonable. Do you agree, Mr. Dyer? Backed into a corner, Dyer had little choice. Yes, Your Honor, though we would request expedition of this search. So ordered, Keller replied. The parties will agree on search parameters and a neutral examiner by close of business today. The search will be conducted within 72 hours. Archie gathered her papers. As for the emergency petition alleging violation of the asset freeze, that is denied. The court finds Ms. Hartford's actions were consistent with her fiduciary responsibilities. As Judge Keller stood to leave, Dyer made one final attempt. Your Honor, there's also the matter of the federal investigation. My clients are concerned that Ms. Hartford may have orchestrated these events to cast suspicion on them. Keller paused, her expression cooling. Mr. Dyer, are you suggesting that Ms. Hartford arranged for criminals to attempt to breach her own company's security systems, then alerted federal authorities to create some elaborate ruse? Because that would be an extraordinary claim requiring extraordinary evidence. Dyer backpedaled immediately. We're merely noting the timing is suspicious, Your Honor. Noted, Keller replied dryly. Court is adjourned. As people began To file out, I caught Ethan watching me with an expression I'd never seen during our marriage, something between fear and grudging respect. Vanessa whispered furiously to him. Her composure fully evaporated, but he seemed barely to hear her, his attention fixed on me. Our eyes met across the courtroom. For a split second, I glimpsed uncertainty in his gaze, the first crack in his confident facade. Then Vanessa tugged his arm sharply, breaking the connection as they followed Dyer toward the exit. That went well, Frost observed quietly as we gathered our materials. Better than expected. They seemed rattled, I noted, especially during the discussion about the ledger. A fabrication, obviously, but it tells us something interesting about their strategy. They're fishing, I concluded. They don't actually know what documents exist. They're hoping to gain access to the backup data to find something, anything they can use. Frost nodded. Exactly. Which means they're operating with less information than they want us to believe. As we left the courtroom, a court officer approached with an envelope. Ms. Hartford, this was left for you at security. I accepted it cautiously, waiting until we reached a private alcove before opening it. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a typed message. The breach was only their first attempt. Hargrove is calling in favors. Watch for Barrett McCormick. They're cleaner when legal channels fail. F. Frank, I murmured, showing the note to Frost. Who's Barrett McCormick? Frost's expression darkened. Former Special Forces, now works as a consultant for certain powerful interests. He specializes in resolving problematic situations through means that don't appear in any legal textbook. A fixer, I translated. More accurately, a hammer. If they're bringing in McCormick, they're abandoning subtlety for brute force. I folded the note carefully, slipping it into my pocket alongside the chess queen that had become my talisman. What's our next move? Frost checked his watch. We need to coordinate with the federal investigators. The two men arrested last night are already talking, hoping for reduced charges. If we can formally connect them to Ethan or Vanessa, we gain significant leverage. And Senator Hargrove? That's complicated. Frost lowered his voice further. Your father was building a case against him very carefully. The evidence on Frank's drive is compelling, but would be challenging to introduce properly in court. Because of how it was obtained? Partly. There's also the matter of Hargrove's influence. Judges, prosecutors, even FBI directors can find their careers suddenly derailed if they target someone of his stature without airtight evidence. As we walked toward the exit, I noticed a distinguished older man observing us from near the courthouse. Steps. Gray-haired, impeccably dressed in a tailored suit, he had the confident bearing of someone accustomed to authority. Frost, I said quietly. Don't look now, but is that... Senator Hargrove himself, Frost confirmed, maintaining his casual pace, making his presence known, a warning. The senator watched us with calm interest, making no attempt to approach or speak. His message was delivered simply by being there, a reminder of his reach and influence. As we passed, he inclined his head slightly in my direction, the gesture somewhere between acknowledgement and challenge. I returned the nod, keeping my expression neutral despite the chill that ran through me. Outside, safely in Frost's car, I released a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. He's not even trying to maintain distance. He wants us to know he's involved. Power often breeds arrogance, Frost replied, starting the engine. Men like Hargrove believe themselves untouchable. They flaunt their connections because it usually intimidates opponents into backing down. I'm not backing down, I said firmly. Frost glanced at me, a hint of approval in his eyes. No, you're not. Which is why we need to accelerate our timeline. Hargrove's open involvement changes the dynamics considerably. He pulled into traffic, heading not toward Hartford Estate but in the direction of the federal building downtown. I have a contact in the U.S. Attorney's office. Someone your father trusted. If we move quickly, we might be able to use today's victory to create a more significant opportunity. What kind of opportunity? The kind that could give us access to resources and protections otherwise unavailable to private citizens. The kind that could level the playing field against someone like Hargrove. I understood. We had won a skirmish in court today, but the larger battle required allies with authority matching our opponents. If we could convince federal prosecutors to formally investigate the conspiracy my father had uncovered, we would gain the backing of an institution even Hargrove would hesitate to challenge directly. As we drove, I reviewed the morning's events. Judge Keller's ruling had prevented Ethan and Vanessa from accessing Hartford Legal's data, but it was a defensive victory at best. To truly protect my father's legacy and bring his enemies to justice, we needed to shift from defense to offense. Frank's warning about Barrett McCormick suggested that our opponents were already making that transition. Having failed through legal channels and cyber intrusion, they were escalating to methods that would leave no paper trail. The chess queen in my pocket seemed to grow heavier with the realization. In chess, the transition from opening to middle game often requires sacrificing the defensive position to create attacking opportunities. My father had taught me to recognize when that moment arrived, when protection must give way to calculated aggression. That moment had come. The path forward was suddenly clear, not through continued legal maneuvering, but through direct confrontation with the forces that had targeted my father. Senator William Hargrove had shown his face today, confident in his untouchability. My father had spent years gathering evidence against him, building a case piece by meticulous piece. Now that case was in my hands, along with the responsibility to use it effectively. "I'm ready," I told Frost as the federal building came into view, its American flag snapping in the autumn breeze. "Whatever your contact suggests, whatever risk is involved, I'm ready." He nodded, understanding the commitment behind my words. Your father would be proud. As we parked, my phone chimed with a text from an unknown number. Tonight. 8 p.m., the place where your father taught you to swim. Come alone. Last chance for peaceful resolution. Ethan, reaching out separately from Vanessa. Interesting and concerning. I showed Frost the message. His frown deepened. A trap, possibly. Or an opportunity, I countered, thinking of the boathouse where my father had taught me to swim as a child, the same place where Frank had given me the USB drive. Either way, it tells us something important. What's that? They're not as united as they want us to believe. I slipped the phone back into my pocket, decision made. Division in their ranks creates leverage we didn't have before. Frost studied me for a moment, then nodded slowly. Just be careful. Don't forget what your father always said about seeming opportunities. I smiled slightly, completing the familiar advice. The most tempting opportunities often conceal the deadliest traps. But I also remembered the corollary my father would add, his eyes twinkling with strategic pleasure. And the most effective traps are those the target mistakes for opportunities. Ethan thought he was setting a trap, offering a peaceful resolution that would undoubtedly involve my surrender. In some form. He didn't realize he was providing exactly what we needed, a chance to drive a wedge between him and his co-conspirators, to extract information that could strengthen our position with federal authorities. As we walked into the federal building, I felt a subtle shift in my perspective, from reacting to their moves to anticipating them, from defending against their attacks to planning my own. The path forward had appeared, unexpected but clear. Tonight's meeting with Ethan would be a gamble, but one with potential rewards that justified the risk. If I played it correctly, I might gain not just information, but a strategic advantage that would alter the course of this battle. For the first time since my father's death, I felt not just determined, but confident. The chess queen wasn't just a talisman anymore. It was a reminder of the power I was learning to wield. The federal building housed an imposing array of agencies. their offices stacked in a bureaucratic hierarchy that mirrored their relative power and influence. Frost led me past security with practiced ease, his credentials opening doors that would have remained firmly closed to me alone. Martin DeSalvo is a senior prosecutor with the Organized Crime and Public Corruption Division, Frost explained as we rode the elevator to the 11th floor. He worked with your father on several cases over the years, discreetly, of course. My father never mentioned him, I noted. He wouldn't have. Their collaboration was kept deliberately low profile, especially after they began looking into connections between certain financial crimes and political figures. The elevator doors opened to reveal a bustling office space. Unlike the marble grandeur of the courthouse, this environment was utilitarian. Cubicles, filing cabinets, and the constant hum of phones and computers. No mahogany panels or leather chairs here, just the industrial machinery of federal law enforcement. DeSalvo met us in a small conference room, closing the door firmly behind us. In his early 50s, with salt and pepper hair cropped close to his scalp and eyes that seemed to catalog every detail, he projected quiet competence rather than intimidation. "Ms. Hartford," he greeted me, his handshake firm but not aggressive. "I wish we were meeting under better circumstances. Your father was a remarkable man." "Thank you," I replied, noticing the genuine respect in his voice. "Mr. Frost says you worked with him." DeSalvo nodded, gesturing for us to sit. "For the past 4 years, your father has been providing evidence related to what we believe is a sophisticated financial crime network operating within estate planning circles." "Operation Safeguard," I said. His eyebrows rose slightly. "You're familiar with the operation?" "I've been reviewing my father's files since his death. I know he was tracking a group that infiltrates estate planning firms to access confidential client information." DeSalvo exchanged a glance with Frost before continuing. "What you may not know is that this isn't just about wealth extraction. The organization uses the intelligence gathered from these firms to manipulate markets, influence political decisions, and blackmail key figures in finance and government." "Including Senator Hargrove?" I ventured. DeSalvo's expression remained carefully neutral. "I can't comment on specific targets of ongoing investigations." "Senator Hargrove was at the courthouse this morning," I pressed, making sure I saw him. "That's concerning," DeSalvo admitted, "and consistent with his reputation for intimidation tactics." Frost placed a small encrypted drive on the table. "We've obtained additional evidence that may advance your investigation significantly. This contains documentation linking several key players, including detailed financial records and communication logs." DeSalvo eyed the drive with professional interest. "Source?" "Frank Donovan," I supplied. "He claims he was working with my father as a double agent in the final year before his death." DeSalvo's carefully maintained neutrality slipped momentarily, revealing surprise. "Donovan flipped? That wasn't in any of our briefings." "My father kept that information compartmentalized," Frost explained. "If Donovan's cooperation became known, his value as an insider would have been compromised." "And you've verified this evidence?" DeSalvo asked, making no move to touch the drive. "Preliminary review only," Frost replied. "But it appears consistent with other intelligence your father gathered. Most importantly, it identifies the leadership structure that has remained elusive until now." DeSalvo leaned back, considering this information. "I'll need to run this through proper channels. Evidence obtained through potentially questionable means presence challenges for prosecution." "We understand," I said. "But given recent developments, including the attempted breach at Hartford Legal and direct intimidation tactics, we believe time is of the essence." DeSalvo studied me for a moment. "Ms. Hartford, I appreciated your father's methodical approach to building this case. He understood the risks of moving too quickly against powerful individuals without absolutely airtight evidence. My father had the luxury of anonymity," I countered. "They didn't know he was investigating them until the very end. I don't have that advantage. They're targeting me directly now. To emphasize the point, I showed him Ethan's text message about the meeting at the boathouse. DeSalvo read it twice, his expression hardening. This is a clear solicitation for what could be construed as obstruction of justice, he noted. Potentially useful, but also dangerous for you personally. I intend to meet him, I said simply. DeSalvo shook his head immediately. Absolutely not. Not without proper preparation and surveillance support. I glanced at Frost, who nodded almost imperceptibly. This was the opening we had hoped for. What would constitute proper support? I asked. DeSalvo outlined a rapid but comprehensive plan. Recording devices, remote monitoring, agents positioned discreetly around the meeting location. Standard procedure for protected witnesses meeting with potential suspects. I'm not asking Ethan to incriminate himself directly, I clarified. I doubt he would, regardless of the circumstances. But I believe he's looking for a way out, a separate piece that protects him while sacrificing Vanessa and potentially others. What makes you think that? DeSalvo asked. 7 years of marriage, I replied simply. Ethan is ambitious but ultimately pragmatic. He recognizes a losing position when he sees one. And the fact that he's reaching out independently without Vanessa's knowledge suggests fractures in their alliance. DeSalvo considered this. Creating division among co-conspirators is a valuable strategy. If Caldwell provides actionable intelligence, we could potentially offer considerations regarding his own culpability. The conversation continued for another hour, evolving from theoretical discussion to concrete planning. By the time we left the federal building, I had been fitted with a nearly undetectable recording device and given a crash course in interview techniques designed to elicit incriminating statements. Remember, DeSalvo instructed as we prepared to leave, your safety is the priority. If at any point you feel threatened, use the duress signal we discussed, and our team will intervene immediately. I nodded, the weight of what I was undertaking finally settling fully on my shoulders. This wasn't a negotiation over marital assets or a legal maneuver in probate court. I was actively participating in a federal investigation targeting powerful, potentially dangerous individuals. One last thing, DeSalvo added. We've been monitoring Barrett McCormick's movements since he arrived in the city yesterday. So far, he's maintained his distance, but that could change quickly, especially if Caldwell deviates from whatever script he's been given. You think Ethan is being watched too? I asked. Almost certainly. The organization doesn't trust anyone completely. Not even their own operatives. McCormick's presence likely serves dual purposes, applying pressure to your circle while also ensuring Caldwell and his wife remain in line. Outside, the afternoon sun had broken through the morning clouds, casting long shadows across the federal plaza. Frost and I walked in silence toward his car, both processing the implications of our new alliance with DeSalvo's team. We're committed now, Frost said finally as we reached the vehicle. Once federal authorities formally open an investigation based on evidence we've provided, there's no turning back. I passed the point of no return the moment I activated the Sentinel protocol, I replied. Everything since has just been making it official. He nodded, acknowledging the truth in my statement. What's your plan until the meeting tonight? I need to go home, review everything I know about Ethan, his patterns, his weaknesses, his tells when he's lying. I checked my watch. And I should speak with Nicola. She knew my father's strategies better than anyone. I'll have a protection detail established at Hartford Estate within the hour, Frost said. DeSalvo's team will handle the boathouse area, but I want additional security at the main house as well. The drive back to Hartford Estate passed quickly, my mind occupied with preparation for the evening's confrontation. I mentally catalogued everything I knew about Ethan, both from our marriage and from what I had learned since discovering his involvement in the conspiracy. Ethan Caldwell had grown up in comfortable but not wealthy circumstances, the son of a bank manager and a high school teacher. Ambitious from an early age, he had worked his way through law school, accumulating debt but also valuable connections. We had met during my final year at Harvard Law. He was a third-year associate at a prestigious Boston firm, assigned as my mentor during a summer program. Our courtship had been swift, our marriage seemingly solid. For 5 years, we had been the perfect professional couple, hosting dinner parties for colleagues, vacationing in the right locations, building our respective careers. The first cracks appeared when I declined a partnership track at his firm, choosing instead to work with my father at Hartford Legal. Ethan had never understood my dedication to my father's practice, viewing it as a step down from the high stakes corporate law he preferred. In retrospect, his increased distance after that decision made more sense. Had he married me primarily for my connections to my father's firm? Had he been recruited by the organization even then, tasked with gaining inside access through me? The divorce had come as a shock, not just Ethan's affair with Vanessa, but the cold efficiency with which he had dismantled our shared life. He had calculated every move, from the timing of his announcement to the division of assets. I had been too hurt at the time to recognize the strategic thinking behind his actions. Now I needed to use that same analytical understanding of his character to prepare for tonight's meeting. What did Ethan truly want? What leverage did I have that could compel his cooperation? At Hartford Estate, I found Nicola waiting in the library, surrounded by files and a laptop displaying what appeared to be financial records. "You've been busy," she observed as I entered. "Productive morning," I confirmed, pouring myself coffee from the pot Corinne had left. "Court ruled in our favor on the emergency petition. Then we met with federal prosecutor Martin DeSalvo." Nicola closed her laptop. "Your father mentioned DeSalvo occasionally. Good man, by all accounts." "He seems to be. He's providing support for a meeting I'm having tonight with Ethan." Her eyebrows rose. "Ethan reached out?" I showed her the text message. She read it carefully before handing the phone back. "A trap, obviously," she concluded. "Obviously," I agreed, "but potentially useful nonetheless. What's your objective?" I considered the question. "Information, primarily. Ethan knows more than he's revealed about the organization's structure and plans. If I can create enough doubt about his position within their hierarchy, he might be willing to provide intelligence to save himself." Nicola nodded approvingly. "Your father always said leverage comes from understanding what the other party truly values. What does Ethan value most?" "Himself," I replied without hesitation. "His comfort, his status, his future prospects. He's not ideologically committed to the organization. He's an opportunist who saw a path to wealth and influence." "Precisely. And opportunists can always be turned when a better opportunity presents itself." Nicola tapped a folder on the table beside her. "I've been reviewing the financial trails your father documented. Ethan has been well compensated for his participation, but he's not among the primary beneficiaries." She opened the folder, revealing complex diagrams tracking money flows through various shell companies and offshore accounts. "See here, Vanessa's financial connection runs deeper. She's been involved longer and has direct ties to entities controlled by Senator Hargrove's inner circle." I studied the documents, seeing the pattern emerge. She recruited him, not the other way around. Almost certainly, their relationship likely began as a professional recruitment that evolved into a personal connection, or at least the appearance of one. This aligned with what I had observed in court. Vanessa had seemed to be directing Ethan, not partnering with him as an equal. Their whispered disagreements suggested a hierarchy I hadn't fully appreciated. "So Vanessa is Ethan's handler," I mused, "which means she reports to someone higher up, possibly directly to Hargrove." That would be consistent with what your father uncovered about their organizational structure. They operate in cells, with handlers managing small groups of assets who often don't know the full scope of operations. I considered this information, mentally adjusting my approach for the evening's meeting. If Ethan is lower in the hierarchy than Vanessa, he may not have access to the most damaging information. But he likely knows enough to implicate others, including Vanessa herself, Nicola pointed out. And sometimes foot soldiers make the best witnesses precisely because they can testify to receiving orders without being implicated in planning the criminal enterprise. We spent the next several hours reviewing documents, developing questions, designed to extract maximum information while revealing minimum strategy, and practicing various approaches depending on Ethan's initial positioning. By late afternoon, DeSalvo's team had established surveillance around the boathouse and provided me with final instructions for the meeting. Frost had arranged additional security for the main house, with armed guards positioned discreetly around the property. As evening approached, I changed into practical clothing, similar to what I had worn for my previous boathouse meeting with Frank. Dark jeans, boots, and a sweater that would conceal the recording device while allowing freedom of movement if quick action became necessary. In my father's study, I stood before the chess set one last time, contemplating the board. The Black Queen remained in my pocket, my talisman throughout this ordeal. I selected another piece, a white knight, and slipped it into my other pocket. The knight's unique movement pattern had always fascinated me as a child, its ability to jump over other pieces, creating opportunities invisible to opponents focused only on direct lines of attack. Tonight, I would need that same ability to approach from unexpected angles, to bypass Ethan's defenses and create an opening he wouldn't anticipate. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the manicured grounds of Hartford Estate, I made my final preparations. The recording device was tested, the duress signal rehearsed, the emergency protocols committed to memory. Whatever Ethan's true intentions, whether genuine outreach or elaborate trap, I was as prepared as possible for the confrontation ahead. The game had reached a critical juncture, with pieces positioned for a sequence that would fundamentally alter the board. I left through the kitchen door, nodding to Corinne, who watched with worried eyes but said nothing. She had witnessed enough of the Hartford family's battles over the years to understand that some confrontations couldn't be avoided, only faced with whatever courage one could muster. The path to the boathouse stretched before me, security lights, activating automatically as I walked. Somewhere in the shadows, federal agents maintained their silent vigil, ready to intervene if necessary. The knowledge of their presence was reassuring, but ultimately, this meeting would come down to the same elements that had defined my relationship with Ethan from the beginning: perception, manipulation, and the careful calibration of truth against advantage. By the time I reached the edge of the woods, with the boathouse visible through the trees, I had achieved a state of focused calm. The pieces were in motion, the strategy set. Now it was time to play the game to its conclusion, whatever that might be. The boathouse loomed before me, silhouetted against the darkening sky. A light glowed from within, warm against the gathering dusk. Ethan had arrived early, a departure from his habitual lateness during our marriage. This meeting mattered to him. I paused at the edge of the clearing, scanning the area. Nothing seemed amiss, but the hairs on the back of my neck prickled with awareness that I was being watched, not just by the federal agents concealed among the trees, but potentially by others with less benevolent intentions. The wooden dock creaked beneath my feet as I approached, each step measured and deliberate. Through the window, I could see Ethan's silhouette pacing inside, his restless movement betraying nervousness that contradicted the confident demeanor he had projected. In court, I knocked once before entering, the door swinging open to reveal my ex-husband standing beside the old wooden table at the center of the room. He had dressed down for the occasion, jeans and a sweater rather than his usual tailored suits, an Attempt to evoke nostalgia, perhaps, reminiscent of our early dating days when casual weekends at my family's estate had been part of our relationship. "Rebecca," he said, his voice carefully modulated. "Thank you for coming." "Your message suggested urgency," I replied, remaining near the door. "Though I'm curious why you wanted to meet here, of all places." Ethan gestured vaguely around the boathouse. "Neutral ground in a way. Good memories, before everything got complicated." I raised an eyebrow. "Attempting to steal my father's estate through forged documents goes beyond complicated, Ethan." He winced slightly, having the grace to look uncomfortable. "That's why I wanted to meet privately. There are aspects of this situation you don't understand." "Enlighten me, then." Ethan ran a hand through his hair, a gesture I recognized from our marriage, one he employed when searching for the right words. "I didn't want any of this to happen, Rebecca. You have to believe that." "What I believe is irrelevant. The evidence speaks for itself." "The evidence is incomplete," he countered, moving toward the window to peer out briefly before turning back to me. "You've seen pieces of a much larger puzzle. Your father understood that better than anyone." I kept my expression neutral, though his mention of my father sent a spike of anger through me. "Don't pretend you knew my father better than I did." "I'm not claiming that," he said quickly, "but I do know things about his investigation that you don't, including who he was really targeting." This was unexpected. If Ethan was trying to bargain with information, it suggested he had more valuable intelligence than DeSalvo had anticipated. "Go on," I prompted, moving to sit at the small table, positioning myself so the recording device would capture his words clearly. Ethan remained standing, tension evident in his posture. "What do you know about Senator Hargrove's connection to Hartford Legal Consulting?" "I know he's orchestrating attacks against my father's firm and legacy," I replied carefully. "I know he's powerful enough to deploy federal-level resources for personal vendettas." "It goes deeper than that," Ethan said, his voice dropping. "Hargrove and your father have a history that predates any of this. They were classmates at Yale Law, rivals for the same judicial clerkships, competitors for political appointments." This was news to me. My father had rarely discussed his education or early career, focusing instead on his judicial philosophy and legal principles. "Ancient history," I dismissed, watching Ethan carefully. "Hardly seems relevant to forged documents and attempted data breaches." "It's the foundation of everything," Ethan insisted. 30 years ago, your father had evidence that could have destroyed Hargrove's early political career, financial improprieties involving campaign funds. Instead of exposing him, your father used that leverage to extract certain concessions. They've been locked in a chess match ever since, each accumulating power and information to use against the other. I fought to keep my expression neutral, though internally I was reeling from this revelation. Could my principled, ethical father have engaged in what amounted to blackmail? It seemed inconceivable. "That's an interesting narrative," I said evenly. "Difficult to verify, given that my father isn't here to confirm or deny it." Ethan leaned forward, his eyes intent. "Your father's death wasn't natural, Rebecca, but it wasn't Hargrove who ordered it either." My pulse quickened. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying there are players in this game you haven't identified yet. Hargrove is powerful, yes, but he answers to others. People whose names never appear on documents, whose influence extends across industries and national boundaries." "And you know who these people are?" I asked skeptically. "Not all of them. No one does. That's by design. But I've seen enough to understand that what's happening here goes beyond a simple inheritance dispute or even corporate espionage." I studied him carefully, looking for the tells I had learned during our marriage, the slight flush when he exaggerated, the increased blinking when he fabricated. Neither was present now, suggesting he was either telling the truth or had become a much better liar. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked directly. "What do you want, Ethan?" He exhaled slowly. "Protection. For myself, primarily. Also for certain information I've gathered that could implicate the higher levels of this organization." "And Vanessa? Is she included in this protection request?" A flicker of something, guilt perhaps, crossed his features. "Vanessa is more deeply involved than I initially understood. She recruited me specifically because of my connection to you, to Hartford Legal." "She played you," I observed. "She wasn't the only one," Ethan admitted, surprising me with his candor. "I was approached multiple times during our marriage. Subtle overtures, promises of advancement, introductions to influential people. I always declined. Then, after our divorce, when I was vulnerable, Vanessa appeared. The perfect combination of professional opportunity and personal attention. A honey trap, I translated bluntly. He didn't dispute the characterization. By the time I realized who she was really working for, I was already compromised. They had evidence of my involvement in minor illegalities, enough to destroy my career if exposed. "So you became their puppet," I concluded, "targeting my father and now me." "I had little choice," he countered, though without much conviction. "But I've been gathering evidence of my own. Insurance, I thought at first. Then potentially leverage for immunity if things went wrong." "And now they have gone wrong," I noted. "The data breach failed. The court denied your emergency petition. Federal authorities are investigating. Suddenly, cooperation looks like your best option." Ethan didn't deny it. "Self-preservation isn't noble, but it's honest. I'm offering you a straight trade. My evidence and testimony in exchange for immunity and witness protection." "That's not my decision to make," I reminded him. "Federal prosecutors determine cooperation agreements." "But you have influence with them now," he pressed. "Your support would be significant." I considered my response carefully, aware of the recording device capturing every word. "What exactly do you have that would justify such an arrangement?" Ethan glanced toward the window again before reaching inside his jacket. I tensed momentarily, but he withdrew only a small drive similar to the one Frank had given me. Financial records linking Hargrove to offshore accounts that funded operatives targeting dozens of estate planning firms across the country. Communications between Vanessa and her handlers discussing the Hartford legal operation. And most importantly, evidence connecting these activities to an investment group called Sentinel Global. The name meant nothing to me, but Ethan continued before I could ask. Sentinel Global is the public face of the organization, a legitimate investment firm that launders the proceeds from their information theft and blackmail operations. Their board includes former intelligence officers, banking executives, and silent partners represented only by lawyers. He placed the drive on the table between us. "Everything I've managed to collect is here. Bank transfers, emails, meeting recordings. Enough to initiate serious investigations, if not secure immediate indictments." I made no move to take the drive. "And in exchange, you want what, specifically?" "Written assurance from federal prosecutors that my cooperation will be taken into consideration, relocation and identity protection after I testify, and your word that you'll support these terms when speaking with the authorities." "My word," I repeated, unable to keep a hint of bitterness from my voice. "You're asking for my word after everything you've done." Ethan had the decency to look ashamed. "I know I have no right to ask for your trust, but I'm not doing this just to save myself. There are aspects of this conspiracy your father was only beginning to uncover, operations targeting judicial nominations, market manipulations, even election interference. Pretty altruistic for someone who admits to being motivated by self-preservation," I observed. "People can have multiple motivations," he countered. "Yes, I want to avoid prison, but I also want to undo some of the damage I've caused. Your father was a good man, Rebecca. He didn't deserve what happened to him. The sincerity in his voice caught me off guard. During our marriage, Ethan had always maintained a certain emotional distance, treating vulnerability as weakness. This open admission of regret seemed genuine, or a remarkably convincing performance. What exactly do you know about my father's death? I asked directly. Ethan hesitated, clearly weighing his words. I don't have direct evidence linking specific individuals to his death. What I do know is that 3 days before he died, Vanessa received an encrypted message from her handler. I only saw a fragment of it. Hartford problem requires immediate resolution. And you didn't think to warn him? The accusation slipped out before I could contain it. I didn't make the connection until afterward, he replied, his voice strained. I had no reason to think they would. I never imagined they would go that far. Whether this was truth or carefully crafted deception, I couldn't be certain. But the recording would allow DeSalvo's team to analyze his statements for inconsistencies, to cross-reference his claims against other evidence. I need time to consider this, I said finally, and to consult with appropriate authorities about potential cooperation arrangements. Ethan nodded, seemingly relieved that I hadn't dismissed his offer outright. I understand, but we don't have much time. If Vanessa or her handlers suspect I've reached out to you independently, my leverage, and possibly my life, will be forfeit. How long do you have before your absence tonight raises suspicions? I told Vanessa I was meeting with a potential witness who might support our claim. She expects me back at the hotel by 10. I checked my watch, nearly 9, giving us an hour before his cover story expired. Where is Vanessa now? Meeting with legal consultants downtown. At least that's what she told me. In reality, she's probably reporting to her handler about our next steps following the court ruling this morning. This aligned with surveillance. Reports DeSalvo had shared earlier. Vanessa had been observed entering an office building owned by a subsidiary of Sentinel Global. I stood, decision made. I'll contact my representatives. If they're interested in your cooperation, you'll hear from them within 24 hours. Relief washed across Ethan's features. Thank you, Rebecca. Don't thank me yet, I cautioned. If your information proves valuable and verifiable, it may help your situation. If you're withholding anything or attempting manipulation, it will only make things worse. He nodded solemnly. I understand. As I turned to leave, Ethan spoke, again, his voice softer. For what it's worth, I am sorry. Not just for this, but for how our marriage ended. You deserved better. I paused at the door, not turning back. Yes, I did. Without waiting for his response, I stepped outside into the cool evening air. The dock's wooden planks creaked beneath my feet as I walked away, leaving Ethan alone in the boathouse with his regrets and calculations. 20 yards into the trees, a figure materialized from the shadows. One of DeSalvo's agents, maintaining a discreet perimeter around the meeting site. All clear, he murmured into his communication device. Subject is returning now. I continued. Along the path toward the main house, my mind processing the revelations from Ethan's surprising confession. If even half of what he claimed was true, the conspiracy extended far beyond what my father's files had documented, reaching into realms of power and influence that made Senator Hargrove merely a lieutenant in a much larger operation. The chess pieces were moving faster now, positions shifting in ways I hadn't anticipated. Ethan's apparent defection created new possibilities, but also new risks. If his handlers discovered his betrayal, they would move aggressively to contain the damage, potentially, endangering everyone connected to this investigation. Back at the main house, I found DeSalvo waiting in my father's study, having monitored the entire conversation remotely. His expression was thoughtful as he removed his headphones. Your ex-husband is either the most valuable witness we could hope for, or an exceptionally skilled manipulator, he observed as I entered. He's always been both, I replied, sinking into my father's chair. The question is whether his information justifies the protection he's seeking. DeSalvo nodded, already typing notes on his laptop. We'll analyze the drive contents immediately. Cross-reference against known operations. If his claims about Sentinel Global check out, it could provide the organizational framework we've been missing. And if he's playing me? I asked, voicing the doubt that lingered despite Ethan's apparent sincerity. Then he's overplayed his hand, DeSalvo replied simply. Everything he shared tonight is now evidence, regardless of his future cooperation. I nodded, finding some comfort in that assessment. Whether Ethan was genuinely seeking redemption or merely securing his own escape route, the information he had provided brought us one step closer to understanding the forces that had targeted my father. As DeSalvo coordinated with his team, I found myself standing before the chessboard again, contemplating the pieces in their frozen tableau. The white knight, representing Ethan's unexpected move, remained in my pocket, its position on the board now uncertain. Was he truly switching sides, or merely repositioning for a more advantageous attack? Whatever his ultimate motives, tonight's confrontation had revealed vulnerabilities in the opposing forces, divisions and uncertainties that could be exploited. Ethan's apparent break with Vanessa and her handlers created an opening, a weakness, in their previously unified front. In chess, such fractures often preceded the decisive sequence that led to checkmate. The game was accelerating toward its conclusion, the pieces aligning for the final confrontation. And for the first time since my father's death, I felt not just determination but genuine confidence that justice might finally be within reach. Dawn broke over Hartford Estate with a thin, pale light filtering through morning fog. I hadn't slept, spending the night with DeSalvo and his team as they analyzed the contents of Ethan's drive. The library had been transformed into an impromptu command center with laptops, secure communication equipment, and federal agents working in quiet efficiency. Ms. Hartford, DeSalvo called, gesturing me toward his workstation. You should see this. I joined him, accepting the coffee Corinne had just brought in. On his screen was a complex financial diagram tracing millions of dollars through a labyrinth of shell companies, all ultimately flowing to or from Sentinel Global's accounts. Ethan's information checks out, DeSalvo confirmed, highlighting several transactions. These correspond exactly with operations we've been tracking independently. The timing of funds transfers aligns perfectly with known infiltration attempts at estate planning firms across 3 states. So he was telling the truth, I said, the realization settling uncomfortably. Having spent weeks viewing Ethan as an enemy, the possibility that he might now be an ally required a mental adjustment I wasn't entirely prepared to make. About the financial operations, yes, DeSalvo qualified. We're still verifying his claims regarding the organizational structure and Vanessa's role as his handler. Another agent approached, handing DeSalvo a folder. Sir, we've confirmed the communication about the Hartford problem 3 days before Judge Hartford's death. It came from a secure server we've previously linked to Sentinel Global executives. DeSalvo's expression darkened as he reviewed the document. This changes our approach significantly. If we can establish that Victor Hartford's death was not natural, this becomes a homicide investigation with all the additional resources and authority that entails. I gripped my coffee cup tighter. You believe my father was murdered? We're gathering evidence, DeSalvo replied carefully. At minimum, we now have reasonable suspicion to justify exhumation and a more thorough autopsy. The clinical discussion of my father's body being disturbed for forensic examination struck me with unexpected force. I had been so focused on protecting his legacy and seeking justice that I hadn't fully processed the implications of what Ethan had suggested, that my father's death had been deliberately caused. How would they have done it? I asked, needing to understand. The medical examiner found nothing suspicious. There are methods that can induce cardiac events while leaving minimal traces, one of the forensic specialists explained. Certain toxins mimic natural heart failure but metabolize quickly, becoming undetectable in standard examinations. DeSalvo turned to me. We'll need your formal consent for the exhumation. It's not a decision to make lightly. Do it, I said without hesitation. If someone had taken my father's life, I wanted concrete evidence, not just suspicion. Whatever it takes to find the truth. As DeSalvo made arrangements for the necessary legal paperwork, a commotion at the library entrance drew our attention. Frost entered, his typically composed demeanor replaced by urgent concern. "We have a situation," he announced, nodding to DeSalvo before turning to me. Ethan Caldwell never returned to his hotel last night. The implications hit me immediately. Vanessa realized he met with me. It appears so. Hotel security footage shows her leaving shortly after 9, approximately when your meeting with Ethan was taking place. She returned alone around midnight, clearly agitated. This morning, she checked out abruptly, claiming a family emergency. DeSalvo was already on his phone, issuing rapid instructions to mobilize resources. "Get me all traffic camera footage between the Hartford estate and the Hotel Peninsula. Alert TSA about Vanessa Caldwell. She may attempt to flee. And send a team to the boathouse immediately to check for any evidence we missed last night." I thought back to Ethan's departure after our meeting. He had seemed relieved, even cautiously optimistic about the protection arrangement he sought. Had he walked directly into danger after leaving me? Could he have run? I suggested, though, without much conviction. Decided to disappear before making any formal deal with authorities? Frost shook his head. His passport is still in the hotel safe. No unusual financial transactions from his accounts. His car remains in the hotel garage. He wouldn't leave without some kind of preparation, I agreed, knowing Ethan's methodical nature. And if he feared Vanessa had discovered his betrayal, he would have contacted us. Unless he couldn't. The unspoken possibility hung in the air, growing more probable, with each failed attempt to locate him. By mid-morning, the situation had evolved from concerning to alarming. Federal agents had found traces of blood in the woods between the boathouse and the main road. Not conclusive proof of violence against Ethan, but enough to elevate the urgency of the search. Vanessa had successfully evaded surveillance, her trail going cold at a private airfield 20 miles outside the city. Flight records indicated a charter jet had departed for the Cayman Islands, though whether she had been aboard remained unconfirmed. "She's running," DeSalvo concluded during our status update. "The question is whether she's running from potential arrest or from her own handlers who might blame her for Ethan's defection." The answer came unexpectedly at 11:42 a.m., when my phone rang with an unknown number. I answered on speaker, with DeSalvo and Frost listening intently. "Rebecca Hartford." Vanessa's voice was tightly controlled, all traces of her previous smugness erased by what sounded like genuine fear. "Are federal agents with you now?" I glanced at DeSalvo, who nodded, for me to continue. "Yes." "Good. I need to negotiate terms immediately. I have information about your father's murder and about Sentinel Global's operations that goes far beyond anything Ethan could have provided." DeSalvo signaled for the call to be traced, writing quickly on a notepad. "Keep her talking. Get specifics." "Why should I believe you?" I asked. "You've done nothing but lie and manipulate since you entered my life." "Because right now, I'm the only person who knows where Ethan is being held," she replied. "And if I don't check in with certain parties within the hour, your ex-husband will be killed." The blunt statement sent a chill through the room. DeSalvo wrote another note. "Ask for proof of life." "How do I know Ethan is still alive?" I demanded. "You'll have to take my word until I'm sure of my own safety," Vanessa countered. "I want full immunity, witness protection, and relocation outside the country. In exchange, I'll provide everything: names, dates, operational details, financial records far more extensive than what Ethan had access to. DeSalvo wrote, "Location? Where is she?" "Where are you now, Vanessa?" I asked, following his lead. "Somewhere safe for the moment. But that won't last long. They know Ethan met with you. They suspect I've been compromised as well. I need assurances before I come in." DeSalvo nodded to an agent who had just entered with an update on the trace. The agent shook his head. They hadn't pinpointed her location yet. "I can't guarantee anything without authorization from the prosecutors," I said, stalling as the trace continued. "But Ethan's cooperation would be viewed favorably if he provides valuable intelligence." "Ethan is irrelevant now," Vanessa snapped. "He was just a tool, useful for accessing you and your father, nothing more. I'm offering direct knowledge of Sentinel Global's leadership and operations." Her dismissal of Ethan reinforced what we had already suspected about their relationship. She had never valued him as anything more than an asset to be deployed and discarded. "If Ethan is irrelevant, why are you using him as leverage?" I challenged. A pause. "Because I know you, Rebecca. Despite everything, you still care what happens. To him. Your sense of justice wouldn't allow you to abandon him, even after his betrayal." The assessment was uncomfortably accurate. Despite the pain of our divorce and his subsequent actions, I couldn't simply write off Ethan's life as collateral damage. "Let me speak to him," I insisted. "Impossible right now. But I can tell you this. He's being held at a property owned by Sentinel Global through one of their shell companies. A warehouse near the old industrial district. I can provide the exact location once my immunity is secured." DeSalvo wrote, "We need more specific information. Get her to commit to details." "You're asking for extraordinary accommodations, Vanessa. I need more than vague promises. Tell me something concrete about my father's death, something that proves your insider knowledge." Another pause, longer this time. When Vanessa spoke again, her voice had dropped to nearly a whisper. "Your father wasn't supposed to die. The order was to pressure him, to force him to destroy his evidence and abandon his investigation. The operative sent to deliver this message exceeded his authority. He used a substance called compound K17, developed for intelligence agencies, undetectable by standard toxicology. It induces cardiac arrest that appears natural." DeSalvo and the other agents exchanged significant looks. Compound K17 was not public knowledge. Its existence and properties were classified information known only to certain government agencies and, apparently, the organization behind Sentinel Global. "Who authorized this?" I pressed. "I can only discuss those details once my protection is guaranteed," Vanessa replied. "But I will tell you this. The operative who administered the compound was Barrett McCormick." The name sent a ripple of recognition through the federal agents. McCormick's involvement provided a direct link between Sentinel Global and my father's death, the first concrete evidence of murder rather than mere suspicious circumstances. DeSalvo nodded to me, silently confirming that Vanessa's information was valuable enough to justify continued negotiation. "I'll need to consult with federal prosecutors about potential terms," I said. "How do I reach you?" "You don't. I'll contact you again in 1 hour. By then, I expect at least preliminary assurances regarding immunity and protection. Otherwise..." She left the threat unspoken but clear. The call ended abruptly. DeSalvo immediately turned to his team. "Tell me we got something on the trace." "Partial," an agent reported. "She's somewhere in the northern sector of the city, likely using a burner phone with signal bouncing. We've narrowed it to approximately 3 square miles. "Not good enough," DeSalvo muttered. "Get aerial surveillance over that sector immediately. And I want every property owned by Sentinel Global or its subsidiaries identified and put under observation, especially any warehouses in the industrial district." As the team mobilized, Frost pulled me aside. This changes everything. If McCormick was directly involved in your father's death, and if Vanessa can testify to that effect, then we have the murder case DeSalvo needs to expand the investigation. I finished. But first we need to find Ethan. If he's still alive, Frost cautioned gently. I nodded, acknowledging the possibility I had been avoiding. Vanessa wouldn't use him as leverage if she didn't believe he had value. For now, we proceed as if he's alive and recoverable. DeSalvo joined us, his expression grim but determined. I've spoken with the U.S. attorney. Given the new information about Compound K-17 and McCormick's involvement, they're prepared to discuss immunity parameters for Vanessa, with significant conditions and restrictions. Will it be enough to satisfy her? I asked. That depends on how desperate she truly is, DeSalvo replied. Her handlers won't simply let her walk away with what she knows. She's smart enough to realize that only federal protection offers any real chance of survival now. The next hour passed in tense preparation. DeSalvo's team identified 3 potential warehouses matching Vanessa's description, deploying surveillance teams to each location. Meanwhile, forensic specialists researched Compound K-17, confirming that specialized testing could potentially detect residual markers even months after administration. When Vanessa called again, precisely 1 hour later, we were ready. The call was routed through secure systems designed to extend the trace while maintaining clear communication. "Have you made arrangements?" she demanded without preamble. "The U.S. attorney is prepared to discuss limited immunity in exchange for your complete cooperation and testimony," I replied, following the script DeSalvo had prepared. "But first, we need verification that Ethan is alive and confirmation of his exact location." "No verification until I'm secure," Vanessa insisted. "I'm exposed every moment I remain in contact." DeSalvo passed me a note. "They've narrowed her location. Keep her talking." "Vanessa, you approached me. You're asking for extraordinary accommodations based on the value of your information. But so far, you've provided only enough to prove you have some insider knowledge, not enough to justify full immunity." Her frustration was palpable even through the phone. "What more do you want? I've already implicated McCormick in your father's murder." "Tell me about Senator Hargrove's role," I pressed. "Ethan mentioned a history between him and my father dating back decades." A brief silence. "Hargrove is merely a facilitator, influential but not irreplaceable. The true power lies with the board." "What board?" "Sentinel Global's shadow leadership, 7 individuals who direct operations globally. Your father had identified 3 of them before his death." DeSalvo nodded encouragingly as the trace continued. Each piece of information Vanessa provided not only extended the trace, but also gave us leverage for future negotiations. "Why target estate planning firms specifically?" I asked, genuinely curious about the strategy behind their operations. "Follow the money," Vanessa replied. "Estate planners for the ultra-wealthy know everything. Offshore accounts, hidden assets, blackmail material kept for leverage. It's not just about financial gain, it's about power and control. Information that can influence judges, regulators, politicians." DeSalvo suddenly straightened, excitement visible in his eyes as he received an update from his team. He wrote quickly, "We have her location. Warehouse number 2 shows thermal signatures consistent with multiple individuals." Understanding the message, I shifted tactics. "I believe you, Vanessa. The U.S. attorney has authorized me to offer conditional immunity pending your full cooperation and testimony, but we need to move quickly. Where can we meet?" Her relief was audible. "There's a self-storage facility on Westbrook Avenue, Unit 247. I'll be there in 30 minutes. Come alone. Just you and federal agents. No local police." "I'll be there," I promised. As I ended the call, DeSalvo was already mobilizing his team. "We've located her at the Northside Marina, likely on a boat, and we have positive identification of thermal signatures at warehouse number 2. suggesting at least 4 individuals, 1 stationary, possibly restrained, and 3 others in movement patterns consistent with guards. "Ethan," I said, certain now that Vanessa had been telling the truth about his captivity, if not her willingness to help rescue him. "Most likely," DeSalvo agreed. "We're deploying tactical teams to both locations simultaneously. The Marina team will apprehend Vanessa before she realizes we've tracked her. The warehouse team will secure the building and extract any hostages." "What do you need from me?" I asked, ready to assist however necessary. "Stay here, where it's secure," DeSalvo instructed. "If anything goes wrong at either location, this could escalate quickly. Your safety remains a priority." Despite understanding the logic, I bristled at being sidelined at this critical juncture. This is my fight too. My father's legacy, my ex-husband's life at stake. DeSalvo considered me for a moment. "You can monitor the operations from our command vehicle, but you remain outside the tactical perimeter. That's the most I can offer." It wasn't ideal, but it was better than being left behind entirely. Agreed. As the teams prepared for simultaneous raids, I found myself returning to the chessboard in my father's study one last time. The game had accelerated beyond my initial expectations, pieces moving rapidly toward what promised to be a dramatic conclusion. Vanessa's betrayal of her handlers, Ethan's capture, McCormick's direct implication in my father's murder. Each development shifted the board in unexpected ways. What had begun as a simple inheritance dispute had expanded into a far-reaching conspiracy involving murder, political corruption, and international financial crimes. I picked up the white king from the board, turning it in my fingers thoughtfully. In chess, the king was the ultimate target, the piece whose capture ended the game. Until now, we had focused on the visible pieces: Ethan, Vanessa, even Senator Hargrove. But somewhere beyond them all sat the true power behind Sentinel Global, the shadowy board that Vanessa had mentioned. Today's operations might secure valuable pieces, but the game wouldn't truly end until we identified and exposed those ultimate decision-makers. My father had begun that process, sacrificing his safety to gather evidence against them. Now it fell to me to complete his mission, to pursue the endgame he had so carefully prepared. With renewed determination, I joined DeSalvo's team as they departed for the warehouse district, ready to confront whatever awaited us there. The next few hours would determine not just Ethan's fate, but potentially the direction of the entire investigation and my own role within it. 2 weeks after the raids that secured both Vanessa and Ethan, one willingly surrendering at the marina when surrounded by federal agents, the other found bound and drugged in the warehouse, I stood in Judge Keller's courtroom for what promised to be the final hearing regarding my father's estate. The intervening days had unfolded with dizzying speed. Medical examiners had confirmed the presence of compound K17 in my father's exhumed remains, officially reclassifying his death as homicide. Barrett McCormick had been apprehended attempting to cross the Canadian border, found with documents connecting him directly to Sentinel Global operations. Most significantly, Vanessa's cooperation had exceeded even DeSalvo's expectations. Facing the reality of her situation, abandoned by her handlers and implicated in serious crimes, she had provided detailed testimony about Sentinel Global's structure, operations, and leadership. Ethan, after recovering from his ordeal, had also cooperated fully, though his knowledge proved more limited than Vanessa's. His testimony primarily served to corroborate her account and provide additional context about the initial targeting of Hartford Legal. The grand jury indictments had begun rolling out 3 days ago, Senator Hargrove first, followed by 23 other individuals connected to Sentinel Global's operations. News outlets were calling it one of the largest financial conspiracy cases in decades, with tentacles extending into judicial appointments, regulatory decisions, and even electoral processes. Now, as I settled at the plaintiff's table beside Frost, the courtroom had a distinctly different atmosphere than during our previous appearances. Gone was the tension of adversarial proceedings, replaced by the somber formality of concluding uncontested business. Judge Keller entered precisely on schedule, her expression composed as she took her seat at the bench. "Good morning," she began, surveying the nearly empty courtroom. "We're here to finalize matters related to the estate of Judge Victor Hartford, following the withdrawal of all claims against said estate by the previously named interested parties." She glanced at the documents. Before her, "I have reviewed the forensic accounting reports confirming that all documents purporting to establish business relationships between Judge Hartford and Ethan Caldwell were indeed forgeries. I have also noted the federal indictments against numerous individuals involved in the conspiracy to fraudulently access Hartford estate assets." Frost rose. "Thank you, Your Honor. With all challenges to the will withdrawn and the asset freeze lifted, we request final approval of the estate distribution, according to Judge Hartford's legitimate testamentary documents." Judge Keller nodded. "So ordered. Ms. Hartford, as sole beneficiary and executor, you are hereby authorized to proceed with all distributions and transfers as outlined in your father's will." She paused, her formal demeanor softening slightly. "I knew your father. For many years, Ms. Hartford. He would be proud of how you've protected his legacy." "Thank you, Your Honor," I replied, unexpectedly moved by her personal acknowledgement. With a final rap of her gavel, Judge Keller closed the case that had consumed my life for weeks. The legal battle was over, though the broader investigation into Sentinel Global and its operations would continue for months, possibly years. Outside the courthouse, autumn sunlight illuminated the changing leaves of the oak trees lining the plaza. Frost walked beside me in companionable silence until we reached the bottom of the steps. "So," he said finally, "what comes next for you?" It was a question I had been considering deeply during the quieter moments between depositions, evidence, reviews, and security briefings. With my father's estate secured and his murderers facing justice, I stood at a crossroads of possibility. "Hartford Legal needs restructuring," I replied. "The data breach and subsequent investigations revealed vulnerabilities that need to be addressed." Frost nodded. "True, but that's administrative work that could be delegated. You seem destined for something more significant after all this." His assessment echoed thoughts I had barely allowed myself to acknowledge. The past weeks had transformed me in ways I was still discovering, awakening capabilities and convictions that had remained dormant during my years of corporate law practice. DeSalvo mentioned that the U.S. Attorney's Office is creating a specialized task force, I said carefully, focused on financial crimes targeting estate planning and wealth management. They've expressed interest in having me consult, given my unique perspective on these operations. "A natural fit," Frost agreed, "though I suspect consulting wouldn't satisfy you for long." He knew me well. The deeper I had delved into my father's investigation, the more I had recognized a calling that transcended conventional legal practice. The corruption Sentinel Global represented, the exploitation of wealth and privilege to manipulate systems meant to serve justice, demanded opposition from those with both the knowledge and the will to fight it. "I'm considering a more active role," I admitted. "The FBI has suggested that my experience, combined with Hartford Legal's resources, could be valuable in identifying similar operations targeting other estate planning firms." Frost smiled slightly. "Your father always said you were destined for more than corporate contract reviews. He saw something in you, an inherent sense of justice that mirrors his own." We reached his car, pausing before departing. "What about Ethan?" Frost asked. "Have you spoken with him since his debriefing concluded?" The question was inevitable, though still uncomfortable. Ethan had been moved to a secure location pending the trials where he would testify, his cooperation agreement providing significant protection in exchange for his evidence against higher-level conspirators. Briefly, I replied. He called to apologize again, for everything. The divorce, the deception, his role in targeting my father's firm. And do you accept his apology? I considered the question carefully. I don't know if accept is the right word. I understand his actions better now, the pressures and manipulations that influenced him. That doesn't excuse what he did, but it provides context. Forgiveness is a process, not an event, Frost observed. Your father understood that better than most. The mention of my father brought my thoughts back to the questions Ethan had raised during our boathouse meeting. The suggestion that my father and Senator Hargrove had a history predating the current conflict, that my father might have used leverage against Hargrove decades ago. Do you think my father was as straightforward as I always believed? I asked Frost. Or was there more complexity to him? Ethical compromises I never saw. Frost considered the question with appropriate gravity. Victor Hartford was the most principled man I've ever known, he said finally. But principles aren't always simple, especially when applied to complex situations. Your father understood that justice sometimes requires strategic thinking, even uncomfortable alliances. That's not really an answer, I noted. No, he agreed with a small smile. But it's the truth nonetheless. We all contain multitudes, Rebecca. Your father was no exception. What matters is the sum of his actions, the overall arc of his life's work, which was unquestionably dedicated to justice and the protection of those who trusted him. It was an assessment I could accept, even if questions remained about specific decisions my father had made throughout his career. Perhaps some mysteries were meant to remain unsolved, leaving room for the complexity that defines any fully lived life. We said our goodbyes, Frost heading to a meeting with federal prosecutors while I opted to walk through the park before returning to Hartford Estate. The crisp air and dappled sunlight provided space for reflection that had been scarce. During the whirlwind of recent events, my phone buzzed with a message from DeSalvo. 3 more indictments issued this morning. Board members of Sentinel Global identified through Vanessa's testimony. Call when you can. Progress continued then. The organization that had targeted my father, that had ultimately taken his life, was being dismantled systematically, its leaders facing justice they had believed themselves immune to. A sense of completion settled over me, though not the finality I had expected. This wasn't an ending, but a transition, from defending my father's legacy to extending it in new directions. The work ahead would build on his foundation, while charting territory he could never have anticipated. By the time I reached Hartford Estate, I had made several decisions that would shape my path forward. First, I would accept the U.S. Attorney's offer to join their specialized task force, lending my expertise to identifying and prosecuting operations similar to Sentinel Global. Second, I would restructure Hartford Legal into a firm focused specifically on protecting vulnerable estate planning operations from infiltration and exploitation. And finally, I would establish the Victor Hartford Foundation for Judicial Integrity, an organization dedicated to safeguarding the independence of courts from the kind of corruption and manipulation Sentinel Global had attempted. Corinne met me at the door, her expression lighter than it had been in weeks. It's finished, then? Truly finished? The legal battles, yes, I confirmed, though there's still much work ahead. She nodded, understanding as always. Your father would expect nothing less. There's tea in the study when you're ready. The study remained as it had been, though I had gradually made it my own space in subtle ways, adding research materials related to financial crimes, replacing some of the older law texts with more contemporary references on digital security and forensic accounting. The chess set still occupied its place of honor, though I had finally returned all pieces to their proper positions. The Black Queen and White Knight no longer resided in my pocket, their symbolic purpose fulfilled as I had found my own path, through the conflict. As I settled at my father's desk, now truly my desk, I opened the small journal I had begun keeping during the investigation. On its pages, I had documented not just facts and strategies, but reflections on justice, power, and responsibility. Today, I added a final entry about the courthouse proceedings, concluding with thoughts about the future that now opened before me. The last line I wrote captured the essence of what I had learned through this ordeal. Justice isn't merely the absence of wrongdoing, but the active creation of systems that protect the vulnerable from those who would exploit power. This was my father's legacy. Not just the cases he decided or the firm he built, but the values he embodied and passed on. The true inheritance wasn't his estate, but his purpose. I closed the journal, my gaze falling on a framed photograph I had recently placed on the desk, my father and me at my law school graduation, both of us smiling with shared pride and purpose. He had known even then that the path ahead would require more of me than conventional legal success. He had been preparing me all along for the role I now embraced. Outside, the grounds of Hartford Estate stretched toward the distant boathouse where so many pivotal moments had occurred. The property remained a significant asset, of course, but its true value lay in the foundation it provided, a secure base from which to conduct the work that now called to me. My phone buzzed again with updates from DeSalvo's team. New evidence discovered, additional conspirators identified, further connections established between Sentinel Global and other criminal enterprises. The investigation continued to expand, revealing a network of corruption more extensive than anyone had initially suspected. I responded with my decision to join their task force, committing to the path that now seemed inevitably mine. The relief of securing my father's estate had been replaced by a deeper satisfaction. The knowledge that his work would continue through me, though in ways neither of us could have predicted. As evening approached, I walked the grounds one last time as simply the inheritor of Hartford Estate. Tomorrow, I would begin transitioning to my new role, taking the first steps toward extending my father's legacy beyond what he had built. The boathouse stood peaceful in the gathering dusk, no longer a site of confrontation and revelation, but simply part of the property's history. I stood on the dock where I had met with Frank and later with Ethan, where secrets had been shared and alliances formed that ultimately led to justice. The water reflected the fading light as I contemplated all that had transpired since my father's death. The journey had been unexpected, challenging me in ways I could never have anticipated. I had entered it as Victor Hartford's daughter, defined primarily by my relationship to him and his legacy. I emerged as something more, shaped by his influence, certainly, but also by my own choices. My own confrontation with forces that threatened justice and integrity. The woman who stood on this dock now was not merely an inheritor, but a force, in her own right, with purpose and power earned through conflict and resolution. My husband's new wife had indeed demanded her share of my father's estate, but my lawyer, and ultimately my father himself, through all he had taught me, had other plans. Plans that extended far beyond the distribution of assets or the settling of claims, reaching instead toward a vision of justice that transcended individual cases or disputes. As darkness settled over Hartford Estate, I turned back toward the lights of the main house, ready for whatever challenges awaited. The legal battle over my father's estate had concluded, but the larger fight for the principles he had championed continued, and I was ready to lead that fight, no longer defined by what I had inherited, but by what I would build. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.